The first shot shattered the night. Flames leapt from the wooden fence, painting the desert landscape in violent oranges and reds. The second bullet splintered the porch post just inches from Ethan Mercer's head. He felt the burn before he registered the pain, a hot poker pressed deep into his shoulder blood, already soaking through his worn cotton shirt. "Get down!" Ethan dropped to his knee. Winchester clutched in his good hand. Through the smoke and chaos he saw her Nakia, her silhouette fierce against the flames, as she fired back at the shadows beyond the burning fence. Her long black hair whipped across her face with each recoil, but her aim remained steady. 2 men had already fallen to her shots. Beneath the floorboards, hidden in the small space Ethan had shown her days before, 7-year-old Kimmy pressed her hands over her ears, eyes squeezed shut, lips moving in a silent prayer her mother had taught her. Another volley of gunfire erupted from the darkness. Wood splintered, glass shattered. Ethan felt warmth spreading down his arm, his vision beginning to blur at the edges. "Nakia!" he called, his voice hoarse. "We can't hold them!" She turned to him, her face illuminated by the dancing flames, determination etched into every line. Blood trickled from a cut on her cheek, but her eyes burned brighter than the fire consuming their fence. "I will not let them take our home," she shouted back, reloading with practiced hands that betrayed none of the fear she must have felt. "Not again, our home." The words echoed in Ethan's fading consciousness as another bullet found its mark, tearing through his thigh. He collapsed against the porch railing, the world tilting dangerously. Through the flames, a tall figure emerged, Frank Blackwood rifle, raised, a cruel smile twisting his face. "Did you really think you could hide them from me, Mercer?" He called, his voice cutting through the chaos. "They're mine. They've always been mine." The last thing Ethan saw before darkness claimed him was Nakia standing tall against the night, defending a home that just 2 months ago neither of them had ever imagined sharing. 2 months earlier, Ethan Mercer woke, as he always did, with a start, heart hammering against his ribs, the echo of gunfire still ringing in his ears, though the war had been over for a decade. Dawn had barely begun to soften the darkness outside his window. In the distance, coyotes called to one another, their mournful voices carrying across the empty desert. He sat up, running a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble that had grown over the night. 45 years had carved deep lines into his weathered face, the desert sun, and the ghosts of his past, aging him beyond his years. His right hand moved instinctively to the silver chain around his neck, fingers finding the small brass key that hung there, warm from his skin. The cabin was silent, save for the soft creaking of the wooden beams as they cooled in the pre-dawn air. Ethan's footsteps echoed as he moved to the kitchen, each sound a reminder of how empty the space was. 3 years had passed since he'd heard any voice but his own within these walls. Outside the Arizona desert stretched endlessly, the horizon beginning to blush with the promise of another scorching day. His small ranch sat isolated, the nearest neighbor a half-day's ride away. Just how he preferred it. Ethan built a fire in the stove and put on coffee, his movements mechanical after years of the same routine. As the coffee brewed, he stood at the window, staring out at the lone oak tree that somehow survived in this harsh land. Beneath it, 2 small wooden crosses stood sentinel, weathered by sun and sand, but still standing strong. When the coffee was ready, he poured it into a chipped mug and sat at the rough wooden table. Without conscious thought, he reached for the shelf and took down 3 plates, setting them carefully around the table. 3 cups followed, then 3 sets of utensils, all perfectly arranged. Only one place would be used. This ritual, performed every morning and every evening for 3 years, was as much a part of him now as breathing. Sarah's place to his right, little Emma's to his left, and him alone in the middle, the food on his plate, tasting of dust and memories. As he ate his simple breakfast of cornbread and dried meat, Ethan's eyes drifted to the photograph on the wall, the only decoration in the sparse cabin. Sarah's gentle smile, her hand resting on 5-year-old Emma's shoulder, both forever captured in that moment before the fever took them while he was away, trying to earn enough to build them the proper house he'd promised. The house represented by the key around his neck. The house he'd started but never finished. After breakfast, Ethan cleared the table, carefully washing each unused dish and cup, putting them away until evening, when he would set them out again. Then he strapped on his gun belt, an old army Colt that had seen him through the war, and stepped out to begin the day's work. The sun was fully up now, already baking the red earth. His old dog Rufus limped out from his spot under the porch gray, around the muzzle, and moving stiffly with age. The dog had been Emma's, had slept at the foot of her bed every night. Now he followed Ethan with the same loyalty, though the animal had grown as quiet and withdrawn as his master. "Come on, boy," Ethan said, his voice rough from disuse. "Cattle won't check themselves." As Ethan returned from checking the eastern pasture that afternoon, the horizon darkened to an ominous red-brown. A massive wall of dust rolled toward the ranch like some biblical plague. He quickly gathered his tools, whistled for Rufus, and made for the cabin at a gallop. These storms could strip the flesh from a man's bones if he was caught in the open. For hours, the storm raged. Wind shrieked around the cabin's corners like lost souls, and fine dust found its way through every crack and seam. It was late afternoon when the storm finally began to abate. Ethan opened the door cautiously, stepping onto the porch to survey the damage. The landscape had been transformed. Drifts of red sand piled against the cabin and outbuildings. Even the crosses beneath the oak tree had disappeared beneath the new terrain. Ethan sighed, knowing days of labor awaited him. He stepped down from the porch, intending to check on the livestock, when Rufus suddenly growled a low warning rumble that made Ethan's hand move instinctively to his holstered pistol. That's when he saw her. Standing beside the gatepost, half hidden in the hazy aftermath of the storm, was a child. A little Apache girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old, so slight and still she might have been a mirage born from the dust. Her black hair hung in tangled strands around a dirt-smudged face. Her bare feet were caked with red mud, her simple dress torn and faded. But it was her eyes that caught Ethan, dark, wary, and far older than her years. The girl didn't speak, didn't move. She simply stood, one hand clutching her empty belly, her cracked lips slightly parted. Rufus continued to growl, but there was confusion in the sound now. The old dog tilted his head, sensing no threat from this small intruder, but uncertain nonetheless. "Quiet, Rufus," Ethan commanded softly. Something shifted in Ethan's chest, a feeling long buried stirring to life. He recognized hunger when he saw it. The child was starving. For a moment, he stood frozen, uncertain. Apache children didn't simply wander onto white settlers' ranches alone. Where were her people? Was this some kind of trap? His eyes scanned the horizon, but there was nothing but empty desert and settling dust. "You hungry?" he asked, his voice gruff from disuse. The girl didn't respond, but her eyes fixed on him with new intensity. Ethan gestured toward the cabin. "Come on, then." Inside, Ethan moved to the stove where a pot of beans had been slowly cooking all day. He cut a thick slice of cornbread from the pan, poured a cup of goat's milk, and set them on the table at Emma's place. The girl hesitated, then approached the table like a wild thing might approach a watering hole in lion country, with desperate need tempered by absolute caution. She slid onto the chair, her feet dangling well above the floor. For a moment, she simply stared at the food before her, as if memorizing its appearance. Then she fell upon it, scooping the cornbread into her mouth with both hands, gulping the milk between bites. When she finished, the girl simply sat watching him expectantly. Ethan realized she was waiting to be told what to do next. "You got a name?" he asked. She didn't respond. "Family? Someone looking for you?" Still nothing. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. What was he supposed to do with an Apache child who appeared out of nowhere and wouldn't or couldn't speak? "You can stay the night," he found himself saying. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out where you belong." He went to the chest at the foot of his bed and pulled out a wool blanket, one Sarah had woven years ago. He spread it near the fireplace, far enough from his own bed to maintain propriety, but close enough to the warmth. "You can sleep here," he said, pointing to the blanket. The girl curled up on it, like a small animal, her back to him, and went completely still. Ethan watched her for a moment, feeling an unexpected tightness in his chest. How long had it been since he'd had another living soul in this cabin besides Rufus? How long since he'd spoken more than a dozen words in a day? When he woke at dawn, the blanket lay neatly folded. The girl was gone. Ethan dressed hastily and went outside, calling for Rufus. The old dog limped around the corner of the house alone. "Where'd she go, boy?" Rufus whined softly, looking toward the eastern horizon. But when Ethan returned inside, he noticed something on the table that hadn't been there before, a small bracelet made of painted wooden beads and tiny feathers intricate in its design. A gift, perhaps, or payment for his kindness. Ethan picked it up, turning it over in his calloused fingers. He should throw it away, cut whatever strange connection had formed the night before. Instead, he carried it to the shelf where he kept Sarah and Emma's few remaining possessions, and placed it carefully beside Emma's favorite doll. 4 days passed. The ranch slowly returned to normal as Ethan cleared away the drifts of sand left by the storm. But something had changed. He found himself glancing toward the gate more often, setting out a little extra food at mealtimes just in case. Rufus, too, seemed to be waiting for something, often sitting at the edge of the porch, eyes fixed on the eastern horizon. On the evening of the 4th day, dark clouds began to gather in the west, a rare sight in this part of Arizona. By sunset, they had blanketed the sky, and the first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the desert. Ethan hurried to secure the livestock, making sure the barn was ready for the downpour. As he worked, the wind picked up, carrying with it the sweet, dusty smell of approaching rain. He had just finished and was heading back to the cabin when Rufus suddenly barked, not his usual warning growl, but a sharp alert sound Ethan hadn't heard from the old dog in years. Turning toward the gate, Ethan froze. The girl had returned. But this time she wasn't alone. Beside her stood a woman, tall and straight-backed, despite her obvious exhaustion. Her long black hair was tied back, revealing a face that might once have been beautiful, but was now gaunt with hunger and marked with bruises. Her left arm hung at an awkward angle, wrapped in a blood-stained cloth. Beneath the dirt and exhaustion, there was a fierce dignity in her bearing, a strength that spoke of survival against impossible odds. The woman stopped about 30 feet from the gate, positioning herself slightly in front of the child. Even at this distance, Ethan could see the wariness in her posture, the way her good hand kept the girl partly behind her. "We seek shelter from the storm," the woman called, her voice accented but clear. "Just for tonight." The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, pattering on the dusty ground. "Who are you?" Ethan asked, one hand resting near his holstered pistol. "My name is Nakia. This is my daughter, Kimmy." the woman's chin lifted slightly, pride evident despite her desperate state. "We have nowhere else to go." The rain intensified quickly, turning from scattered drops to a steady downpour. Within moments, both figures were soaked, their thin clothing clinging to their frames. "I can work," Nakia continued, raising her voice over the increasing patter of the rain. "Haul water, cook, tend livestock, clean. Anything you need. We just ask for shelter tonight, even just under your porch." Lightning flashed briefly, illuminating the scene in stark white light. In that instant, Ethan saw something that made his blood run cold, a crescent-shaped scar on the woman's neck, just visible above her collar. A scar he'd seen before on other Apache women, in a village called Snake Valley 7 years ago. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Gunfire, screams, the smell of burning teepees. Women with that same crescent scar, a tribal marking, running, falling, dying. His unit arriving too late to stop the massacre, finding only bodies and a handful of survivors who looked at the soldiers with the same mix of fear and hatred he now saw in this woman's eyes. Ethan's hand fell away from his gun. Whatever this woman's story, whatever danger might follow her, he couldn't turn them away. Not in this storm, not with that scar burning in his vision like a brand. "Come in," he called, stepping aside and gesturing toward the cabin door. Inside the cabin, water dripped from their clothes onto the wooden floor, forming small puddles in the lamplight. "Wait here," Ethan said, moving to the bedroom. He returned with 2 worn but clean shirts and the wool blanket the child had used before. "You can change into these. They'll be big, but they're dry." Nakia accepted them with a nod of thanks. "Is there somewhere?" She glanced around the one-room cabin. "I'll step outside while you change," Ethan said. "There's stew on the stove. Help yourselves." When he returned, both mother and daughter had changed into the shirts he'd provided. Kimmy sat at the table, already eating a bowl of stew with the same desperate hunger she'd shown days earlier. Nakia stood beside her, straight-backed, despite her obvious pain. "You should eat too," Ethan said, gesturing to the stew. "After my daughter has had enough." The simple statement, delivered with quiet dignity, told Ethan more about this woman than 1,000 words could have. She would starve herself to feed her child, had probably been doing exactly that for some time. "There's plenty," he said, moving to the stove. He filled another bowl and set it at Sarah's place. "Please." They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against bowls and the steady drumming of rain on the roof. For the first time in 3 years, all 3 settings were in use. The realization struck him with unexpected force. A phantom pain, like a limb long since amputated, suddenly making itself known. "Your arm needs tending," he said to Nakia after the meal, nodding toward her makeshift bandage. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "It will heal." "Not if it's set wrong." Ethan moved to a trunk near his bed and pulled out a small wooden box, a medical kit left from his army days. "I've some experience with broken bones." Nakia glanced at her daughter, who was now sitting near the fire, her eyelids drooping with exhaustion. Then, reluctantly, she extended her injured arm toward Ethan. He unwrapped the dirty cloth, carefully revealing a clean break of the forearm, probably defensive in nature. With practiced hands, Ethan realigned the bone. Nakia made no sound, though sweat beaded on her forehead, and her free hand clenched into a white-knuckled fist. When the bone was set, he splinted it with thin pieces of wood and bound it tightly with clean bandages. "Thank you," she said simply when he finished, though the words seemed to cost her something. "You and your daughter can take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." "No," Nakia shook her head firmly. "We will not take your bed. The floor is enough." He wanted to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. This was a matter of pride, of maintaining what dignity remained to her in a situation where she had been forced to accept charity. As dawn approached, Ethan lay awake, listening to the storm and the soft breathing of the two strangers in his home. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. "If you want to stay, stay." The words his wife had spoken to him when they first met, when he was the one lost and broken. Words he'd never thought he'd have cause to say to another living soul. The days fell into an uneasy pattern. Ethan watched Nakia, and Nakia watched Ethan, each seeking answers to questions they weren't yet ready to ask aloud. Kimmy, unburdened by the weight of history and suspicion, adapted to ranch life with the resilience of childhood. She followed Rufus around the yard, helped collect eggs from the chicken coop, and spent hours watching the cattle with solemn fascination. A week passed. Nakia's arm began to heal the splint, doing its work. She proved herself useful despite the injury, cooking meals that transformed Ethan's simple provisions into surprisingly flavorful dishes, tending the garden with a knowledge of plants that surpassed his own. But always there was that watchfulness, that careful assessment of everything around her. Ethan recognized it for what it was: the hypervigilance of someone who had survived trauma, who expected danger from every quarter. One evening, as they finished dinner, Ethan made a decision. He crossed to a cabinet and withdrew a bottle of whiskey, one of the few luxuries he allowed himself. "Kimmy's asleep," he said, nodding toward the child curled on her bedroll by the fire. "Would you care for a drink?" Nakia hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, thank you." Ethan poured 2 small glasses and handed one to her. They sat in silence for a while, the whiskey burning a warm path down their throats, the fire crackling in the hearth. "That scar on your neck," Ethan said finally. "It's from Snake Valley, isn't it?" Nakia's needle paused mid-stitch. For a long moment, she was perfectly still, like a deer that had caught the scent of a predator. Then deliberately, she set down her sewing and raised her fingers to the crescent-shaped mark on her neck. "You know of Snake Valley," she said, not a question. "I was there, after." Ethan kept his voice low, conscious of the sleeping child. "My unit was sent to enforce the peace treaty. We arrived too late." Nakia's expression hardened. "Yes, the army always arrives too late. We found survivors." Ethan continued, watching her closely. "They were sent to San Carlos." "Yes, those who survived the journey. But you weren't among them." Nakia held his gaze steadily. "No, I was taken elsewhere." "By whom?" "By a man named Frank Blackwood." The name hit Ethan like a physical blow. Frank Blackwood, a civilian scout who had ridden with Ethan's unit for a time. A man known for his hatred of the Apache, his cruelty masked as frontier justice. He had been suspected of involvement in the Snake Valley massacre, but never charged due to lack of evidence. "Blackwood took you?" Ethan asked, his throat suddenly dry. "Yes, me and others, to a place he called Rattlesnake Canyon." "And the others?" Nakia's eyes dropped to her sleeping daughter. "Dead, all but Kimmy and me." The implications were clear, and the horror of it settled in Ethan's stomach like lead. Women taken as slaves, abused, killed when they were no longer useful. It was a story as old as the frontier itself, rarely spoken of in polite company, but known to every soldier who had served in the territories. "How did you escape?" Nakia's expression closed like a door slamming shut. "That is not a story for tonight." They lapsed back into silence, each lost in private thoughts. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling around the corners of the cabin, carrying with it the lonely call of a coyote. After a while, Nakia spoke again, her voice so quiet, Ethan had to lean forward to hear. Why did you let us stay? The question caught him off guard, not for its content, but for the vulnerability behind it. For the first time since her arrival, Nakia seemed genuinely uncertain, the careful armor of her composure cracked to reveal the woman beneath. "Because this house has been silent for too long," he said finally. Nakia's eyes widened slightly, as if this was the last answer she had expected. For a moment, something flickered across her face, a softening, a recognition of the simple human truth behind his words. The next morning, Ethan found Nakia at the edge of the garden harvesting plants he had always considered weeds. "What are you doing?" he asked. She straightened, holding a bundle of green stalks with small white flowers. "Medicine," she replied, "and other things we might need." Ethan recognized the plants now, jimsonweed known for its medicinal properties, but poisonous in larger doses. "Your wife," Nakia said unexpectedly. "She was a healer, too." Ethan blinked, surprised by the question. "Yes, she was a nurse during the war. How did you know?" Nakia gestured toward the cabin. "The herbs hanging in the kitchen, the medical supplies, the way you set my arm. These are not things most men know." "She taught me," Ethan admitted. "Said a man living alone in the territories should know how to tend to himself." She was wise. Nakia bent to cut another plant, wincing slightly as the movement jarred her injured arm. "Here, let me," Ethan offered, taking the knife from her. "Which ones do you need?" For the next hour, they worked side by side in the garden, Nakia identifying plants and explaining their properties while Ethan harvested them. It was the longest conversation they had shared, and though it centered on practical matters, something shifted between them, a tentative bridge built across the chasm of difference that separated them. That afternoon, as storm clouds gathered again on the horizon, Ethan made a decision. He retrieved his army colt from its place beside his bed and approached Nakia, who was hanging laundry on the line, her movements hampered by her splinted arm. "I want to teach you to use this," he said, holding out the pistol. Nakia looked at the weapon, then at Ethan, her expression questioning. "Why?" "Because if Blackwood finds you, you'll need to defend yourself and Kimmy." Understanding dawned in Nakia's eyes. She set down the laundry and accepted the pistol with appropriate respect for its deadliness. "You think he will come," she said, not a question. "Men like Blackwood don't let go of what they consider theirs," Ethan replied grimly. "And if he was involved in Snake Valley, he has other reasons to want to find you. You're a witness to his crimes." Nakia nodded, her expression hardening. "Yes, he will never stop hunting us. It is why we have run for so long." They moved to a clearing behind the barn, where Ethan had set up several empty bottles on a fence rail. Kimmy stayed behind with Rufus, instructed to remain in the garden where they could see her. "It's louder than you expect," Ethan warned, demonstrating the proper stance. "And there's a backward force when it fires. You need to be prepared for both." Nakia listened intently, her eyes following his every movement, her concentration absolute. When he handed her the pistol, she took it with appropriate respect for its deadliness, adjusting her grip according to his instructions. "Like this." "Almost. Your left elbow needs to be straighter." He reached out to adjust her posture, his hand hovering near her arm, before he caught himself the first time he had almost touched her directly since setting her broken arm. "May I?" he asked, indicating her elbow. A brief hesitation, then Nakia nodded. Ethan gently corrected her stance, his touch light and professional. Still, he couldn't help but notice the warmth of her skin, the tension in her muscles, the way she held herself with a poise that belied her years of captivity. "There," he said, stepping back. "Now aim at that center bottle. Take your time." Nakia sighted down the barrel, her breathing steady, her focus unwavering. For a long moment, she didn't move, simply acclimatizing herself to the feel of the weapon, its weight and balance. Then, with a controlled exhale, she squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the morning air, startling a flock of birds from a nearby tree. The center bottle remained intact, but the one to its left shattered into fragments. "Not bad," Ethan said, genuinely impressed. "A bit to the right, but good for a first shot." Nakia lowered the pistol, a small, fierce smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Again." They spent the next hour practicing. Nakia proved to be a quick study, her natural poise and steady hands making her a promising shooter. By the end of the session, she was hitting her target more often than not, her confidence growing with each successful shot. They returned to find Kimmy sitting on the porch with Rufus, the child's small hand, buried in the dog's grizzled fur. She looked up at their approach, her dark eyes immediately going to the pistol in her mother's hand. "Mama," she asked, uncertainty in her voice. "It's all right, Kimmy," Nakia assured her, tucking the weapon into the pocket of her dress. "Mr. Mercer is teaching me to protect us." It struck Ethan then how much this child must have witnessed in her short life, how early she had learned that the world was a place that required protection against. That evening, as Ethan worked in the barn repairing a broken harness, he became aware of a small presence watching him from the doorway. Looking up, he saw Kimmy standing there, her eyes fixed on him with that solemn, assessing gaze that seemed too old for her years. "Would you like to help?" Ethan asked, gesturing to the harness. After a moment's consideration, the child nodded and approached cautiously, stopping a few feet away. Ethan showed her how to hold the leather strips, while he stitched them together, explaining the process in simple terms. Kimmy listened attentively, her small hands careful with the worn leather. "My mama is afraid," she said unexpectedly, her voice soft but clear. The words caught Ethan by surprise. It was the first time he had heard the child speak more than a word or two. "Of what?" he asked carefully. Kimmy's dark eyes met his, serious and knowing. "The bad man finding us." "Blackwood." She nodded, her small face solemn. "He hurt Mama." The simple statement, delivered with a child's directness, contained worlds of horror. Ethan felt a surge of anger at the thought of what this young girl must have witnessed, what she had been powerless to prevent. "He won't hurt her again." Ethan said the words emerging as a promise he hadn't intended to make. "Or you." Kimmy studied him with that penetrating gaze, as if weighing the truth of his statement. Then, to his surprise, she reached out and touched the key that hung from the chain around his neck, the key he had unconsciously pulled out while working. "What is this for?" she asked. Ethan stiffened his hand, moving instinctively to cover the key. The child withdrew her hand quickly, sensing his discomfort. "Sorry," she whispered, eyes downcast. Regret washed over Ethan. The key was his most private possession, the symbol of his greatest failure. But the hurt on the child's face outweighed his need for secrecy. "It's all right," he said, forcing his voice to gentleness. "This key, it opens a door to a house I started building a long time ago. For your wife and daughter." The question, so innocent yet so piercing, struck Ethan like a physical blow. "Yes," he managed. "For them." Kimmy nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "But they died." "Yes." "Like my father." "Yes." They looked at each other across the small space between them, the aging rancher and the young Apache girl connected by the common thread of loss that ran through their lives. "I'm sorry," Kimmy said simply. "I'm sorry too," Ethan replied, and meant it. That night Ethan was awakened by Rufus's low growl. The old dog stood at the window, hackles raised, staring out into the darkness. Ethan slipped from his bed, reaching for his rifle, careful not to wake Nakia and Kimi, who slept by the fire. Outside, the night was clear, stars scattered like salt across the black sky. For a moment, Ethan saw nothing unusual. Then he caught it, a flicker of movement along the ridge that bordered his property to the north. A rider, moving slowly, deliberately. Ethan's heart rate quickened. Travelers in this part of the territory followed established trails, not ridge lines in the dark. And his nearest neighbor was old Jenkins, who never rode at night if he could help it. "What is it?" Nakia's voice behind him was barely a whisper. Ethan turned to find her standing in the doorway, the pistol he had given her held ready in her hand. Her eyes followed his gaze to the ridge. "Someone's watching the ranch," he said quietly. "Blackwood." The certainty in her voice sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "Maybe. Can't be sure from this distance." "It's him. He's found us." Nakia's expression hardened, a mixture of fear and resignation. "We should leave. Now, before he brings more men." "In the dark. With a child." Ethan shook his head. "Too risky. We're safer here, at least until dawn." Nakia hesitated, clearly torn between the urge to flee and the logic of Ethan's argument. "We'll keep watch," he assured her. "Take turns through the night. If he approaches, we'll be ready." For nearly an hour, Ethan watched as the unseen rider circled his property at a distance, never coming close enough to be clearly seen, but making no effort to conceal his presence either. A message, perhaps. A warning. "I know you're here." Finally, the sounds faded as the rider moved away to the east. Ethan waited another 30 minutes to be sure before turning back to Nakia, who stood vigil at the other window. "Gone," he reported. "For now." Nakia nodded, but her face remained tense, her eyes haunted. "He will be back, with others. Then we need to be ready." Ethan moved to the cabinet where he kept his weapons, taking mental inventory. The Winchester, his pistol, a shotgun he kept for hunting. Not enough for a prolonged siege, but perhaps enough to buy them time. "What will we do?" Nakia asked, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. Ethan considered their options. They could run, pack up and leave tonight, try to reach the nearest town, or maybe head for the reservation at San Carlos. But traveling in the dark with a child would be risky, especially if Blackwood was out there watching. Or they could stay and prepare, fortify the ranch, set watches, be ready when he returned. Because he would return, Ethan was certain of that now. "We stay," he decided. "We prepare, and when he comes back, we'll be ready." Nakia studied him for a long moment, as if seeing him anew. Then she nodded once decision made. "Yes, we stay." She lifted the pistol, checking it with the practiced ease of someone who had been handling weapons all her life, rather than a single day. "And we fight." The next morning, as Ethan checked the eastern fence line, a rider appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the rising sun. Even at this distance, there was something familiar about the man's posture, the way he sat his horse with casual confidence. Frank Blackwood. Ethan's mouth went dry. He had hoped for more time to prepare to plan their defense. But Blackwood was here now, approaching his gate, with the unhurried assurance of a man who believed he held all the cards. Quickly, Ethan checked his pistol, then began walking toward the cabin. He needed to warn Nakia to get her and Kimi hidden before Blackwood reached the house, but he was too late. As he approached the yard, he saw that Blackwood had already dismounted and was standing by the gate. Worse! Nakia was on the porch, frozen in the act of hanging laundry, her eyes fixed on the newcomer with undisguised horror. Kimi, thankfully, was nowhere to be seen, hopefully inside, out of sight. "Well now," Blackwood called, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Ain't this a pretty sight? Been looking for you, Nakia. You and the little one." Nakia said nothing, her body rigid with tension, her hand moving slowly toward the pocket where Ethan knew she kept the pistol. Ethan picked up his pace, approaching from the side, wanting to draw Blackwood's attention away from Nakia. "Something I can help you with," he called. Blackwood turned his hand, dropping instinctively to his gun before he registered who had spoken. Recognition dawned in his eyes, followed by surprise, then a calculating assessment. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his thin lips spreading in a smile that never reached his eyes. "Sergeant Ethan Mercer. Didn't expect to find you out here." "Oh, it's just Mercer now," Ethan replied, positioning himself between Blackwood and the porch. "War's been over a long time." Blackwood's gaze flicked between Ethan and Nakia, his mind visibly working through the implications of finding his escaped captive at the home of a former comrade. "So it has," he agreed, his tone falsely amiable. "Though some fights never really end, do they, Sergeant? What do you want, Blackwood?" The pretense of friendliness dropped from Blackwood's face, replaced by a hard, acquisitive expression. "What's mine? The woman and the child. They belong to me." "No person belongs to another," Ethan said evenly, though his heart was hammering in his chest. "Not in this country. Not anymore." Blackwood laughed, an ugly sound devoid of humor. "That's where you're wrong, Sergeant. The law doesn't apply to savages. Never has. She's not a savage. She's a human being." "She's property," Blackwood countered, his voice hardening. "My property. Took her fair and square from Snake Valley." "There was nothing fair about Snake Valley," Ethan said, his own voice dropping dangerously. "That was a massacre of peaceful people, women and children." Something flickered in Blackwood's eyes, a momentary unease quickly masked. "You always were soft on the hostiles, Mercer. That's why you never made it past Sergeant." Behind Ethan, he heard Nakia's quiet footsteps as she descended the porch stairs, moving to stand beside him. Her face was composed now, the initial shock of seeing her tormentor replaced by a cold, steady resolve. "I am not your property," she said, her voice clear and strong, despite the slight tremor Ethan could detect beneath her words. "I never was. You stole me like a coward steals what he cannot earn." Blackwood's expression darkened, a dangerous light entering his eyes. "You've forgotten your place, woman, but I'll remind you soon enough." His hand moved toward his holster, but Ethan was faster. In one fluid motion, he drew his pistol and leveled it at Blackwood's chest. "Don't," he warned. For a tense moment, the three of them stood locked in a tableau of potential violence, the hot desert sun beating down on them, the only sound the soft nickering of Blackwood's horse at the gate. Then, Blackwood's hand moved away from his holster, raising in a gesture of mock surrender. But his eyes remained cold, calculating. "You're making a mistake, Mercer," he said softly. "These aren't your people. They're not worth dying for." "Maybe not," Ethan agreed. "But some principles are." Something shifted in Blackwood's expression, then a reassessment, as if seeing Ethan clearly for the first time. "So that's how it is. The great Sergeant Mercer, hero of the Apache Wars, now protecting the very savages he once hunted." "I never hunted them," Ethan corrected. "I was sent to enforce peace treaties that men like you kept breaking." "Semantics," Blackwood dismissed with a wave of his hand. "The point is, you're choosing the wrong side. Again. The side of basic human decency isn't the wrong side, Blackwood." A tense silence fell between them, the air thick with unspoken threats. Finally, Blackwood took a step back, his hands still raised. "I'll go," he said, his voice dangerously soft. For now. But this isn't over, Mercer. That woman and her brat belong to me, and I mean to have what's mine." With that he turned and mounted his horse in one fluid motion. Before riding off, he looked back at Ethan, a cold smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You know, Mercer, I always wondered why you left the army so sudden-like after Snake Valley. Now I'm starting to understand. You've got a weakness for these savages. Always have had." "Leave Blackwood," Ethan said, his finger tightening on the trigger. "While you still can." With a final mocking salute, Blackwood wheeled his horse and rode away, dust rising in his wake as he headed back toward the eastern ridge. Only when he had disappeared from sight did Ethan lower his weapon. Beside him, Nakia released a shaky breath, her composure finally cracking to reveal the fear beneath. "He will be back," she said quietly. "And not alone." "I know." Ethan holstered his pistol, his mind already calculating planning. "We need to prepare." They returned to the cabin to find Kimmy hiding under the bed exactly where Nakia had taught her to go in case of danger. The child's eyes were wide with fear, but she emerged when her mother called, running into Nakia's arms. "Was it him?" Kimmy whispered, her small face buried against her mother's shoulder. "Yes," Nakia replied, stroking her daughter's hair. "But he's gone now." "He'll come back," the child said with certainty beyond her years. "Yes," Nakia agreed, exchanging a glance with Ethan over Kimmy's head. "But we'll be ready." That night, as darkness fell over the ranch, they sat at the table sharing a simple meal. The normalcy of the scene. Three people breaking bread together stood in stark contrast to the tension that hummed beneath the surface, the knowledge that this fragile peace could be shattered at any moment. After the meal, when Kimmy had fallen into an uneasy sleep on her bedroll, Ethan and Nakia sat by the fire speaking in low voices to avoid disturbing her. "Tell me about Snake Valley," Nakia said suddenly, "from your perspective." The request caught Ethan off guard. It was not a subject he discussed, not even with himself, in the darkest hours of the night. "Why do you want to know?" Nakia's gaze was steady, unflinching. "Because I was there. Because I lost everything there. And because I need to understand your part in it if we are to trust each other with our lives." It was a fair request, if a difficult one. Ethan looked into the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker, gathering his thoughts. "We were supposed to be peacekeepers," he began, his voice low and rough with memory. "My unit was assigned to enforce the treaty between the Army and the Apache bands in that region. The agreement was that the Apache could maintain their traditional lands at Snake Valley in exchange for peace." He paused, the familiar guilt rising in his throat. "We were camped about a day's ride away when a scout brought word that a group of civilians along with some rogue soldiers were planning to attack the settlement. Something about revenge for a raid that had happened months earlier on a white homestead." Nakia nodded slightly. 6 men from a different band had killed a rancher and his sons, not our people. But to the white men, all Apache looked the same. "Yes," Ethan agreed grimly. "That's how men like Blackwood think. So when we heard about the planned attack, we rode hard to prevent it. But we were too late. By the time we arrived, the massacre was already over." "I was hiding," Nakia said, her voice distant, as if speaking from another time. "With Kimmy's father in a small cave near the stream. We heard the shots, the screams. He went to help, told me to stay hidden. I never saw him alive again." Ethan closed his eyes briefly, the horror of that day washing over him anew. "We found some survivors," he continued. "Women and children mostly. They were sent to San Carlos, but not all of them made it there, did they?" "No," Nakia confirmed. "Blackwood and his men took several of us before your soldiers could organize the evacuation. He told the others we had run away or been killed in the attack. No one questioned him. And you were taken to Rattlesnake Canyon? Yes, a hidden place where he could do as he pleased, with no one to witness. Nakia's voice had grown flat, emotionless, a defense against memories too painful to fully acknowledge. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. The thought of what she must have endured 7 years of captivity under a man like Blackwood filled him with a cold, helpless rage. I left the army soon after, he said, returning to her original question. Couldn't stomach it any more, the broken treaties, the blind eye turned to men like Blackwood. I took my discharge and came out here as far from people as I could get. Nakia was watching him closely, her expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. And now, Ethan met her gaze steadily. Now Blackwood has brought the war to my doorstep, and this time I won't be too late. Something passed between them, then a current of understanding, of shared purpose. For all their differences, they were united in this, the determination to stop Blackwood, to end his reign of terror once and for all. Outside, the desert stretched vast and silent beneath the star-strewn sky. Somewhere out there, Blackwood was gathering his forces, preparing to reclaim what he considered his property. But he would find more than he expected at the Mercer Ranch, not just a lone rancher, but a man with a purpose rekindled, standing alongside a woman whose spirit 7 years of captivity had failed to break. As the night deepened around them, Ethan's hand found the key around his neck, the small token of a promise unfulfilled. And for the first time in years, he felt something stir within him that he had thought long dead hope. In the morning light, Kimmy approached Ethan as he sat cleaning his rifle at the table. "You have to use the key," she said unexpectedly, pointing to his chest where the brass key hung beneath his shirt. Ethan paused, looking at the child in surprise. "What do you mean, I had a dream?" Kimmy continued, her small face serious. "We were in a house on a hill. The bad man couldn't find us there. You opened the door with your key." Nakia appeared from the bedroom, her expression troubled. "Kimmy, do not bother Mr. Mercer with your dreams." "It's all right," Ethan said, pulling the key from beneath his shirt and holding it up for Kimmy to see. "You dreamt I used this key." Kimmy nodded, her eyes fixed on the small brass object with fascination. "To open a door. A safe place." Ethan felt a strange tightness in his chest. The unfinished house, the one he had started building for Sarah and Emma, the one he had abandoned after their deaths. Could it be a safer refuge than the ranch? It was certainly more defensible, built on a small rise overlooking a creek, with clear sightlines in all directions. "It's just a dream," Nakia said again, but her eyes were on Ethan's face, reading something there that gave her pause. "Perhaps," he agreed, tucking the key back beneath his shirt. "But it's worth considering all our options." Before he could explain further, Rufus suddenly barked a sharp, urgent warning that sent Ethan to the window, rifle in hand. On the eastern ridge, dust clouds were rising, riders approaching fast. Too many for it to be just Blackwood returning for another conversation. "They're coming," Ethan said grimly, turning to Nakia. 5, maybe 6 riders. Moving fast." Fear flashed across Nakia's face, quickly replaced by determination. "What do we do?" Ethan's mind raced through their options, each one more desperate than the last. The ranch was exposed with multiple approaches that would be difficult to defend. They were outnumbered, outgunned. And then he thought of Kimmy's dream, the house on the hill, the door opened by his key. "We'll run," he decided. "Now, while we still have time. To the house I built, the one this key opens. It's a day's ride from here, but it's defensible. Better ground." Nakia didn't hesitate. Kimmy, get your things, she ordered, her voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. Only what you can carry. As they hastily gathered supplies, food, water, weapons, a few essential items, Ethan explained his plan. They would take the horse with Nakia and Kimmy riding. He would lead on foot, keeping to rough terrain where possible to conceal their tracks. If they moved quickly and stayed off the main trails, they might reach the valley by nightfall. What if they follow us? Nakia asked as she helped Kimmy onto the horse. They will, Ethan said grimly, checking his rifle one last time before slinging it over his shoulder. But we'll have the advantage of position when they find us. The dust cloud on the horizon was growing larger, more defined. They had minutes, perhaps, before Blackwood and his men arrived. With one last look at the cabin that had been his solitary refuge for 3 years, Ethan turned to the east. "Stay close," he instructed, taking the horse's reins, "and be ready for anything." As they moved away from the ranch, following a dry creek bed that would hide their tracks better than the open desert, Ethan felt the weight of the key against his chest. For years it had been a burden, a reminder of failure and loss. Now perhaps it would fulfill its purpose at last, not as he had originally intended, but as a means of protection, a path to redemption. Behind them, the first riders crested the rise near the ranch. Ahead lay a day's journey through hostile territory with no guarantee of safety at the end. But for the first time since Snake Valley, Ethan Mercer had a clear purpose, a cause worth fighting for. And this time, he would not be too late. The desert held no mercy for those who fled across its unforgiving expanse. By mid-morning, the sun beat down with savage intensity, turning the air into a shimmering haze that distorted the horizon. Ethan led the horse at a steady pace, choosing routes through dry creek beds and rocky outcrops that might hide their trail, though he harbored few illusions about their chances of escaping undetected. Behind him, Nakia sat astride the horse Kimmy held securely in front of her. Neither had complained once, despite the brutal heat and the jarring terrain. They moved like people accustomed to hardship, conserving energy, speaking only when necessary. Rufus trotted alongside them, his aging body showing surprising endurance. The old dog seemed to understand the gravity of their situation, forgoing his usual explorations to stay close to the small party. Around midday, Ethan called a halt in the shadow of a towering rock formation. The brief respite from the sun's onslaught was welcome, though the heat remained oppressive, radiating from the stone around them. "How much farther?" Nakia asked, as she helped Kimmy down from the horse. Ethan squinted at the eastern horizon, calculating. "If we keep this pace, we should reach the valley by nightfall, maybe sooner." He offered his canteen to Nakia and Kimmy first. The child drank sparingly, with the practiced conservation of someone who had known thirst. When Nakia passed the canteen back to Ethan, her fingers brushed against his, a brief accidental contact that nonetheless sent a jolt of awareness through him. "Thank you," she said quietly. Ethan nodded, unable to find words for the complex emotions that simple touch had stirred. He turned away, busying himself with checking the horse's condition, giving the animal water from his hat. As he worked, he scanned their surroundings, eyes searching for any sign of pursuit. The landscape behind them remained empty, but he felt no relief. Blackwood knew this territory well. The absence of visible pursuers meant nothing. "They're coming, aren't they?" Kimmy's small voice broke the silence. Ethan turned to find the child watching him, her dark eyes solemn in her dusty face. The question wasn't fearful, just matter-of-fact, as if she were asking about the weather. "Yes," he answered honestly, "but we have a good start, and they don't know where we're headed." Kimmy nodded, accepting his assessment. She sat cross-legged in the sand, absently stroking Rufus's grizzled head as the dog panted beside her. "The house in my dream," she said after a moment. "It had big windows and trees around it." Ethan stilled, surprised by the accuracy of her description. The unfinished house did indeed have large windows. Sarah had insisted on them, wanting to bring the beauty of the valley inside, and he had deliberately preserved the cottonwoods that grew along the creek. "That's right," he confirmed, glancing at Nakia, who was listening intently. "How did you know that?" Kimmy shrugged, the gesture disarmingly adult on her small frame. "I saw it in my dream." Kimmy has always had dreams that show her things, Nakia explained, her voice low. "Things that have happened or that will happen. It is a gift passed down through my family. My grandmother had it, and her grandmother before her." Ethan had heard of such abilities among the native peoples, dream seers they were called. During his army days he had dismissed such tales as superstition, but after everything he had witnessed in his life, he found himself less certain of the boundaries between the explainable and the mysterious. "And in your dream," he asked Kimmy directly, "were we safe at this house?" The child considered the question with grave seriousness. "For a time," she said finally. "But then the bad man found us." A chill ran down Ethan's spine, despite the oppressive heat. "And then what happened?" Kimmy's brow furrowed in concentration. "I don't know. I woke up." Nakia touched her daughter's shoulder gently. "Dreams show possibilities, not certainties," she reminded her. "The future is never fixed." The words were clearly meant to reassure, but they hung in the air like a prayer neither of them quite believed. The future might not be fixed, but men like Blackwood were implacable in their hatred, relentless in their pursuit. Ethan's hand found the key around his neck, its familiar weight suddenly heavier with significance. For years he had carried it as a memorial, a reminder of what he had lost. Now it represented something else entirely, a potential sanctuary, a second chance, a hope for survival. "We should move on," he said, helping Kimmy remount the horse. "We still have a long way to go." As they resumed their journey, the landscape gradually began to change. The flat, open desert gave way to more varied terrain, rolling hills, deeper arroyos, scattered stands of hardy vegetation. They were approaching the foothills of a low mountain range, the boundary between the desert basin and the hidden valley that held Ethan's unfinished house. The change in topography offered better cover, but also slowed their progress. The horse picked its way carefully over rocky ground, while Ethan led them on a zigzagging path that used the natural features of the land to obscure their trail. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds began to gather in the west, a rare and welcome sight. If rain came, it would erase their tracks, make pursuit that much harder. "Storm's coming," Ethan observed, glancing at the darkening sky. "Might buy us some time." Nakia followed his gaze, her expression thoughtful. "Or it could trap us. Flash floods in these canyons can be deadly." She was right, of course. Desert storms were as dangerous as they were precious, unleashing months' worth of rain in furious concentrated bursts that transformed dry creek beds into raging torrents within minutes. "We'll stay high when we can," Ethan agreed. "Follow the ridge lines." As the first distant rumble of thunder reached them, Kimmy suddenly pointed ahead. "Look!" Following her gesture, Ethan saw what had caught her attention, a plume of dust rising from behind a ridge about a mile to their east. Not a natural formation, but the sign of riders moving fast. "Down," he ordered, pulling the horse behind a cluster of boulders. "Stay low." They crouched in the meager shelter, hardly daring to breathe as they watched the dust cloud move from left to right across their path. 3 riders, maybe 4, crossing the valley ahead of them. "Blackwood," Nakia whispered. "Maybe Ethan replied, his voice equally low. Or it could be a patrol from Fort Grant. Either way, best not to be seen. They remained hidden until the riders had passed well beyond their position. Only then did Ethan risk a careful survey of their surroundings. They're headed north, he reported. Away from the valley. Looking for us in the wrong direction, Nakia concluded, relief evident in her voice. For now, but they'll circle back eventually. We need to keep moving. The brief encounter had cost them valuable time and daylight. The storm clouds were moving in faster now, turning the western sky an ominous gray-black. The air had taken on that peculiar stillness that precedes a major weather event, heavy with expectation. They pushed on with renewed urgency, following a narrow game trail that wound through increasingly rugged terrain. The first fat drops of rain began to fall as they reached the mouth of a small canyon, the last significant obstacle before the valley that held Ethan's unfinished house. We need to get through before the rain gets heavy, Ethan said, eyeing the steep walls that rose on either side of the trail. Once the water starts flowing, this place will be a death trap. They urged the horse forward, moving as quickly as the treacherous ground would allow. The rain intensified, pattering on the rocks around them, turning the dusty trail to slick mud. Thunder crashed overhead closer now, and the air crackled with electricity. Halfway through the canyon, the storm broke in earnest. Rain fell in blinding sheets, instantly drenching them to the skin. The dry creek bed beneath their feet began to gurgle and spit as water collected from the surrounding terrain, funneling into the narrow passage. "Hurry!" Ethan called over the roar of the storm, taking the horse's bridle and pulling the animal forward. "We don't have much time." They splashed through rapidly deepening water, the current already tugging at their legs. Kimmy clung to her mother, face buried against Nakia's shoulder, to shield herself from the driving rain. Rufus paddled alongside them, his old eyes wide with alarm. The canyon seemed to stretch endlessly before them, the exit nowhere in sight. The water rose with frightening speed, reaching Ethan's knees, then his thighs. The horse snorted in distress, fighting the current that threatened to sweep its legs from under it. Just as Ethan began to fear they'd have to turn back, risk climbing the canyon walls, he spotted it, a widening in the passage ahead, the end of the narrow defile. "Almost there!" he shouted, though his words were nearly lost in the cacophony of the storm. With a final push, they emerged from the canyon into a broader valley, just as a wall of water came rushing down from the heights behind them. The flash flood crashed through the passage they had just exited, carrying branches, stones, and debris in its churning brown fury. They stood on higher ground, soaked and shaking, but alive, watching as the canyon became an impassable torrent. Behind them, the eastern sky remained relatively clear, creating the strange phenomenon of rain falling through sunshine. A rainbow arced across the valley, its colors vivid against the dark storm clouds. "Look, Mama!" Kimmy pointed at the rainbow, her face alight with wonder despite their ordeal. "A good sign," Nakia said, smoothing her daughter's wet hair back from her face. "A path to follow." Ethan watched them for a moment, struck by their resilience. Then his eyes moved beyond them to a low ridge that rose at the far end of the valley. "There," he said, pointing, "just beyond that rise. That's where the house is." Despite their exhaustion, despite the continued downpour, they found renewed energy. They crossed the valley floor as the rain gradually diminished to a gentle patter following a creek swollen with storm water. Cottonwood trees lined its banks, their leaves whispering in the freshened air. As they crested the rise, the house came into view. It stood on a small plateau overlooking the valley, its weathered frame silhouetted against the clearing sky. It was not large, just a simple two-story structure with a covered porch and those large windows Kimi had described. A chimney rose from the center of the roof, and a small stable stood to one side. The foundation was stone, the walls timber, the whole thing built to last. But it was unfinished. Portions of the exterior remained uncovered, the raw framework exposed like the ribs of some great beast. Some windows were merely empty openings, and the front door hung slightly askew on its hinges. Yet despite its incomplete state, it had endured the years remarkably well. The roof appeared sound, the basic structure solid. Ethan stared at it, a tumult of emotions washing over him. This was the house he had begun building for Sarah and Emma, the dream that had died with them. He had not laid eyes on it since that terrible day when he returned to find them both gone. The future he had planned evaporated like morning dew. "It's beautiful," Nakia said softly beside him. Ethan glanced at her, surprised by the simple assessment. The house was hardly beautiful in its current state, abandoned unfinished, a monument to failure. Yet looking at it through her eyes, he could see what it might have been, what it still could be. "It needs work," he said gruffly, masking the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "But it'll keep us dry tonight." They approached slowly, Ethan leading the way with a watchfulness born of long experience. Though the house had been abandoned for years, caution was still warranted. Travelers' animals, or worse, might have taken shelter there in his absence. The yard was overgrown with native grasses and wildflowers, now bending under the weight of raindrops. A path of flat stones nearly hidden by vegetation led to the front steps. The porch creaked under Ethan's weight as he mounted it, testing each board before committing himself. The door was secured by a heavy padlock, rusted but intact. Ethan's hand went to the key around his neck, the small brass token he had carried for so long. It felt strangely appropriate that this would be its first use in 3 years. The lock resisted at first, the mechanism stiff with disuse. Then, with a grating sound, it turned. The padlock fell open in Ethan's palm, unexpectedly heavy. He paused, his hand on the door, suddenly reluctant to push it open. Beyond this threshold lay memories he had spent years avoiding, ghosts he wasn't sure he was ready to face. "Ethan." Nakia's voice behind him was gentle questioning. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Then he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dim, illuminated only by what light filtered through the uncovered windows. Dust motes danced in the beams of late afternoon sun, disturbed by the first human presence in years. The air was stale but dry, the roof having done its job of keeping out the elements. Ethan moved further inside, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. The main floor was a single large room with a stone fireplace at one end and a rough-hewn staircase leading to the upper level at the other. A few pieces of furniture stood about, covered in sheets that had once been white but were now gray with dust. A table, some chairs, a cabinet. Nakia and Kimi followed him, in Rufus at their heels. The dog moved cautiously, sniffing at every corner, perhaps searching for traces of the little girl who should have lived here. "It's just as I dreamed it," Kimi said in a hushed voice, her eyes wide as she took in the space. Ethan glanced at her sharply. "You saw inside the house, too?" She nodded solemnly. "There was a fire there," she pointed to the cold hearth. "And we sat at that table. The bad man couldn't find us, because the rain washed away our tracks." The accuracy of her vision sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. It was one thing to describe the general appearance of the house, which might be explained by coincidence, but the specific interior details were harder to dismiss. "Well, let's hope that part of your dream comes true," he said, making an effort to keep his voice light. "For now, we need to make this place livable." The next hour was spent in practical tasks, clearing out dust and cobwebs, checking the structure for any dangerous weaknesses, taking inventory of what supplies remained from Ethan's last visit years before. To his surprise, there was quite a bit tools in the lean-to shed, some preserved foods in sealed containers, even a stack of firewood that had remained relatively dry. Nakia worked alongside him with quiet efficiency, anticipating his needs and finding practical solutions to problems as they arose. Kimi helped too in her own way, exploring every corner of the house with the fearless curiosity of childhood, occasionally calling out discoveries: a bird's nest in the rafters, a family of mice in the pantry, a collection of pretty stones left on a windowsill. As dusk approached, Ethan managed to get a fire going in the hearth. The chimney drew well, filling the room with the comforting smell of wood smoke. Nakia prepared a simple meal from their supplies, supplemented by wild onions she had gathered during their journey. They ate by firelight, seated at the dusty table that Ethan had built with his own hands for a family that never came to be. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him: 3 fugitives taking shelter in a house meant for happiness and new beginnings. "This was to be your home," Nakia said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "With your wife and daughter." Ethan nodded, his throat suddenly tight. "Started building it after the war. Wanted a fresh start, somewhere peaceful. Somewhere Emma could grow up safe." "It would have been a good place for a child," Nakia observed, her eyes moving to Kimi, who had curled up with Rufus near the fire, both already dozing after the exhaustion of the day. "It still could be." The simple statement hung in the air between them, laden with possibilities neither of them was ready to acknowledge. "Tell me about her," Nakia said after a moment. "Your wife." Ethan hesitated. He had not spoken of Sarah at length to anyone in years, but something in Nakia's gentle inquiry, in the quiet intimacy of the firelit room, loosened the tight control he normally maintained over his memories. Sarah was— He paused, searching for words adequate to describe the woman who had been the center of his world. Strong, determined, had a way of seeing right through a person's defenses to what was beneath. That's what made her such a good nurse. She could tell what a man needed, even when he couldn't say it himself. Nakia listened intently, her dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. There was no pity in her gaze, only genuine interest. "We met during the war," Ethan continued. "I was wounded at Shiloh. Nothing serious, but enough to land me in the field hospital where she was working. She had a sharp tongue and no patience for self-pity." A small smile touched his lips at the memory. "Told me I could either lie there feeling sorry for myself or get up and make myself useful." "And did you?" Nakia asked. "Got up, started helping with the other wounded men. By the time I was fit to return to my unit, I knew I wanted to marry her." Ethan's hand went to the key around his neck, a habitual gesture. "Wrote to her all through the rest of the war. When it was over, we got married and came out west." "And your daughter?" "Emma was born a year later. Brightest little thing you ever saw. Always asking questions, always wanting to know how things worked." His voice roughened with emotion. "She was 5 when the fever took them both. I was away buying lumber to finish this house. By the time I got back—" He couldn't continue. The memory of returning to their small cabin, finding the neighbor woman waiting with the terrible news, was still too painful to articulate. Nakia reached across the table, her hand coming to rest gently on his. The contact was brief, but steadying, an acknowledgement of his loss, without the hollow platitudes that so often accompanied expressions of sympathy. "They would be proud of what you're doing now," she said simply. Ethan looked up, surprised by her assessment. "What am I doing? Protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Standing against men like Blackwood. Fulfilling the promise of this house to be a place of safety. He had not thought of it that way, had not allowed himself to see his current actions as connected to the man he had been before. Loss had hollowed him out, left him a shell, going through the motions of existence. But Nakia saw the connection, and in her eyes he glimpsed a version of himself he had thought long dead, a man of principle, of action, of purpose. "What about you?" he asked, deflecting attention from himself. "You said Kimmy's father died at Snake Valley. Were you married long?" A shadow crossed Nakia's face, a flicker of old grief. 2 years. Nakohe was a good man, gentle, thoughtful. He taught in the mission school for a time, believed our peoples could live together in peace. Her mouth twisted in a bitter smile. His trust cost him his life. "I'm sorry." Ethan said the words inadequate, but sincere. Nakia acknowledged his sympathy with a slight nod. "I was already carrying Kimmy when Blackwood took me. I hid my condition as long as I could, knowing what happened to pregnant women in such places." Ethan's stomach clenched at the implication. He had heard stories during the war, whispered accounts of atrocities committed against Native women, children taken away, pregnancies forcibly terminated. "When I could hide it no longer, I'd told Blackwood the child was his." Nakia continued, her voice steady despite the horror of the memory. "It was the only way to ensure he would let me keep her." "And he believed you." He wanted to believe. It fed his sense of ownership, his pride. Her eyes hardened. "When Kimmy was born with her father's face, not his, I feared he would kill her. But by then, he had developed a different kind of attachment. The child became another form of control over me, a threat he could hold against my obedience." The casual cruelty of it, the calculated psychological torture, filled Ethan with cold rage. That Nakia had survived such treatment with her spirit intact seemed nothing short of miraculous. "How did you escape, finally?" he asked. "There was a storm," she replied, her gaze turning distant with memory. "Like the one today, but stronger. It destroyed part of the compound where he kept us. In the confusion, I took my chance. Gathered what supplies I could, took Kimmy, and ran into the night." "And you've been running ever since?" "Yes, moving at night, hiding during the day, taking work where I could find it, always moving east, away from Rattlesnake Canyon." She hesitated, then added, "Until we found your ranch." Something in her tone caught Ethan's attention, a slight emphasis that suggested more than chance had guided their meeting. "You knew who I was," he said slowly, the pieces finally falling into place. "When you came to my gate. You already knew." Nakia met his gaze steadily. "Yes." "How?" "During my time with Blackwood, I had access to his things when he was away. He kept mementos from Snake Valley, a ledger with names, a map. Your name was there along with others from your unit. After I escaped, I began searching for someone who might believe my story, who might help us. And you chose me. Why? Because in Blackwood's notes, you were the only one he described as sympathetic to the hostiles, the only one he seemed to hate almost as much as he hated my people." A small grim smile touched her lips. "I reasoned that the enemy of my enemy might prove a friend." The revelation should have angered him, the calculation behind her appearance at his gate, the deliberate seeking out of his isolated ranch. But Ethan found he couldn't summon any resentment. In her position, he would have done the same. Survival demanded pragmatism, not purity of motive. "I did not know if you would help us," Nakia continued. "I was prepared to leave if you turned us away, but I had to try." "And now," Ethan asked, "what was your plan after you found me?" Nakia's expression grew troubled. There was no plan beyond survival. Perhaps to reach the eastern territories, where Blackwood's influence doesn't extend. Or to find my people at San Carlos, though the reservation is little better than a prison. The precariousness of their situation hung heavy in the air between them. Even if they eluded Blackwood's immediate pursuit, there was no clear path forward. The world offered few safe havens for a fugitive Apache woman and her child. Before Ethan could respond, a sound from outside caught his attention, a faint but distinct crack, like a branch breaking under a careless foot. He raised a hand, silencing any further conversation. Nakia went still, instantly alert to the potential danger. With practiced stealth, Ethan moved to the nearest window, keeping himself to the side of the frame where he wouldn't be silhouetted against the firelight. He peered out into the gathering darkness, every sense straining. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the rain-washed yard, the shadowy outline of trees, the horse tethered beneath the lean-to shelter. Then a movement at the edge of the clearing caught his eye. A darker shadow detached itself from the trees, moving with deliberate slowness toward the house. Ethan's hand went to his pistol. "Someone's out there," he whispered, returning to where Nakia now stood by the fire, her own hand on the weapon she carried. "Just one from what I can see. Coming in from the east." "Blackwood!" Nakia's voice was barely audible. "Can't tell, but if it is, he's alone for now." They moved with silent efficiency, dousing the fire with sand from a bucket kept beside the hearth, plunging the room into darkness. Kimmy woke at the sudden activity but remained silent, instantly understanding the need for quiet. Rufus growled softly, his hackles rising. "Upstairs," Ethan directed, guiding them toward the rough staircase. "There's a storage room with no windows. Stay there until I call for you." Nakia hesitated clearly, reluctant to leave him to face the danger alone. "We should stay together," she whispered. "If it's Blackwood, he'll expect that. Better to split up, give us more options." Ethan pressed his pistol into her hand. "Take this. Anything comes up those stairs that isn't me, shoot it." After a moment's hesitation, Nakia nodded. She gathered Kimmy into her arms and ascended the stairs, moving with remarkable quietness despite the darkness. Rufus tried to follow, but Ethan held him back. "Stay, boy," he commanded softly. "With me." When he was certain Nakia and Kimmy were safely concealed in the upstairs room, Ethan took up position beside the front door, rifle in hand. Rufus crouched at his side, a low rumble of warning emanating from the old dog's chest. Minutes stretched into an eternity of tense waiting. Outside, the night had fully descended, the only illumination coming from the stars and a thin crescent moon that occasionally peeked through breaks in the lingering clouds. Then a sound on the porch, a careful footstep, the faint creak of weathered wood. A shadow passed before one of the windows, pausing as if to peer inside. Ethan raised his rifle, aiming at the door. His finger rested lightly on the trigger, ready to apply pressure at the first sign of entry. The doorknob turned slowly, testing. Finding it locked, the shadow moved away, circling toward the back of the house, where some windows remained uncovered. Ethan adjusted his position, following the movement, anticipating where the intruder would try next. Rufus kept pace beside him, unusually silent, as if understanding the need for absolute stealth. A soft scraping sound came from a window at the rear of the house, the sound of someone trying to force the shutters open. Ethan moved toward it, rifle raised. Before he could reach the window, the sound stopped. For a long moment, silence reigned. Then, without warning, a tremendous crash as something heavy was thrown through the glass. Ethan dropped to a crouch as shards of glass exploded inward. A dark shape vaulted through the now empty window frame, landing heavily on the wooden floor. "Mercer?" a familiar voice called. "I know you're in here. You and those Apache whores." Blackwood. He had found them. Rufus launched himself toward the intruder, teeth bared a furious growl tearing from his throat. Blackwood cursed, firing a shot that missed the charging dog in the darkness. Ethan seized the momentary distraction to take aim. His rifle cracked the sound deafening in the confined space. Blackwood howled in pain as the bullet found its mark in his shoulder, spinning him half around. But he didn't fall. Instead, he fired blindly in Ethan's direction, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating his face, contorted with rage and pain, but still deadly dangerous. The bullet splintered the doorframe beside Ethan's head, showering him with fragments of wood. He ducked behind the staircase, seeking cover, as Blackwood fired again. Rufus, meanwhile, had latched onto Blackwood's leg, teeth sunk deep into the man's calf. Blackwood kicked frantically, trying to dislodge the old dog while maintaining his guard against Ethan. "Call off your mutt, Mercer!" he shouted, voice tight with pain. "Or I swear I'll skin him alive!" Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he used the distraction to circle around, trying to get a clear shot. But the darkness and the erratic movement of both Blackwood and Rufus made it too risky he might hit the dog instead of his target. With a vicious curse, Blackwood finally managed to land a solid kick to Rufus's ribs. The old dog yelped in pain, losing his grip. A second kick sent him sliding across the floor, where he lay still whimpering softly. "That's for your dog," Blackwood snarled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "And this is for you." He fired again, the bullet embedding itself in the staircase where Ethan had been moments before. But Ethan had already moved, sliding behind the stone chimney for better cover. "Where are they, Mercer?" Blackwood demanded, his voice echoing in the empty house. "Where are you hiding them?" "They're gone! Blackwood!" Ethan called back, trying to draw the man's attention away from the stairs that led to Nakia and Kimi's hiding place. "Long gone. I sent them on ahead while I waited for you." A harsh laugh answered him. "You always were a poor liar, Sergeant. I know they're here. I can smell them." A pause, then in a louder voice. "Nakia, come out now, and maybe I'll let your protector live. Hide, and I'll make you watch while I kill him slow." From upstairs, only silence answered his threat. Ethan used the momentary diversion to peek around the chimney, trying to get a fix on Blackwood's position. The man had moved to the center of the room, keeping his back to the wall, pistol sweeping the darkness. Blood darkened his shirt, where Ethan's bullet had struck, but he showed no signs of weakening. If anything, the wound seemed to have fueled his rage, making him more dangerous. Ethan knew he needed to end this quickly. Blackwood might claim to be alone, but there was no guarantee his men weren't nearby, perhaps waiting for a signal to approach. And Ethan's own ammunition was limited, a few rounds for the rifle, nothing more now that he had given his pistol to Nakia. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out from behind the chimney, rifle raised. "It's over, Blackwood," he said evenly. "Drop your gun and walk away. No one else needs to get hurt tonight." Blackwood's response was immediate and vicious. 2 shots fired in rapid succession, forcing Ethan back behind the chimney. "It'll be over when I say it's over," Blackwood shouted, his voice edged with a madness that hadn't been there before. "You took what's mine, Mercer, just like you tried to take my glory at Snake Valley." "Snake Valley was a massacre," Ethan retorted, trying to keep the man talking while he looked for an opening. "There was no glory in it, only murder. They were savages, animals." Blackwood's voice rose in pitch, becoming almost frenzied. "They deserved what they got, and so will you for harboring them." Ethan risked another glance around the edge of the chimney. In the faint moonlight now filtering through the broken window, he could see that Blackwood had moved closer to the stairs, his attention divided between watching for Ethan and listening for any sound from above. Time was running out. If Blackwood went upstairs, he would find Nakia and Kimi trapped in the storage room. Making a swift decision, Ethan stepped fully into view, rifle aimed directly at Blackwood's chest. "Last chance, Blackwood," he warned. "Drop it." For a heartbeat, the two men stared at each other across the darkened room, the weight of their shared past and present conflict hanging between them like a physical presence. Then Blackwood smiled a terrible, empty expression that never reached his eyes and began to raise his pistol. Two shots rang out simultaneously. Ethan felt the burn as Blackwood's bullet grazed his side, tearing through his shirt and leaving a trail of fire along his ribs. His own shot struck truer, catching Blackwood squarely in the chest. The impact knocked the man backward, his pistol clattering to the floor. He stumbled, one hand going to the spreading darkness on his shirt, his face a mask of surprise and outrage. "You shot me!" he gasped, as if the concept were incomprehensible. "Yes," Ethan said simply, keeping his rifle trained on the wounded man. Blackwood took a staggering step forward, then another, his face contorted with effort and hatred. "Not over," he wheezed, reaching inside his jacket with his free hand. Too late, Ethan saw the gleam of a knife. Blackwood lunged forward with unexpected speed, the blade arcing toward Ethan's throat. A shot cracked from the staircase. Blackwood jerked backward, a look of almost comical surprise crossing his features. He turned slowly, looking up to where Nakia stood on the stairs, Ethan's pistol still raised in a steady hand. "You," he said, his voice barely audible. "You—" He never finished the sentence. His legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor, the knife falling from suddenly lifeless fingers. A last rattling breath escaped him, and then he lay still, his empty eyes staring at the ceiling. For a long moment, neither Ethan nor Nakia moved, the echo of the gunshot still ringing in the confined space. Then, with a small sound that might have been a sob, Nakia lowered the pistol. "Is he dead?" she asked, her voice remarkably steady, despite the tremor that ran through her body. Ethan approached Blackwood's motionless form cautiously, rifle still trained on the man. He nudged the fallen knife away, then knelt to check for a pulse at the throat. "Nothing." "Yes," he confirmed, straightening. "He's dead." Nakia descended the rest of the stairs slowly, her eyes never leaving Blackwood's body, as if she feared he might somehow rise again. When she reached the bottom, she handed the pistol back to Ethan, her fingers cold against his. "You're hurt," she said, noticing the blood seeping through his shirt. "Just a graze." Ethan was already moving toward Rufus, who had begun to stir on the floor, where Blackwood's kick had left him. "How's the dog?" Nakia knelt beside the animal, her hands moving gently over his ribs. "Bruised, perhaps cracked ribs, but he will live." She glanced up at Ethan, her expression grave. Was Blackwood alone? It was the question that had been nagging at Ethan as well. Blackwood was not the type to pursue a personal vendetta without backup, especially after their earlier confrontation at the ranch. "I don't think so," he replied, moving to the broken window to scan the darkness outside. "He might have left his men nearby waiting for a signal, or he might have been so consumed with finding us that he rode ahead alone," Nakia suggested, though she didn't sound convinced of her own hypothesis. "Either way, we can't stay here," Ethan decided. "This house isn't defensible with that broken window, and if his men are nearby, they'll come looking when he doesn't return." "Where will we go?" Nakia asked, her hand moving to the stairs where Kimmy still waited in the storage room, obediently silent, despite the gunfire and commotion. "It's night, and there's no shelter for miles." Ethan considered their options, limited though they were. The storm had passed, but the ground was still wet, the night air chilly. Traveling in darkness with a child and an injured dog would be dangerous, especially if Blackwood's men were searching the area. But staying put with a broken window and a dead body seemed equally perilous. His eyes fell on Blackwood's corpse, sprawled in a growing pool of blood, on the floor of the house he had built for Sarah and Emma. The sight should have brought satisfaction, justice, for Snake Valley, for Nakia's 7 years of captivity, for all the other victims of Blackwood's cruelty. Instead, he felt only a hollow weariness, a sense that violence, even justified, solved nothing. It only perpetuated the cycle of blood and retribution that had defined the territories for too long. "We'll take his horse," Ethan said finally. "Ride west toward Fort Grant. There's an army patrol in the area, we saw them earlier. If we can find them, they can offer protection." Nakia's expression grew guarded. "The army is not always a friend to my people," she reminded him. "No," Ethan agreed, "but right now, they're a better bet than waiting here for Blackwood's men to find us." After a brief hesitation, Nakia nodded. "I will get Kimmy." While she went upstairs to retrieve her daughter, Ethan quickly gathered what supplies he could, strapping them into a makeshift pack. He checked on Rufus, relieved to find the old dog able to stand, though he whimpered when he moved too quickly. "Good boy," Ethan murmured gently, stroking the grizzled head. "Brave old soldier. We'll get you somewhere safe." When Nakia returned with Kimmy, the child's eyes went immediately to Blackwood's body. But there was no fear in her gaze, only a solemn recognition, as if she had expected this outcome all along. "Is the bad man gone now?" she asked, her small voice unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "Yes," Nakia answered, turning her daughter away from the gruesome sight. "He cannot hurt us anymore." Ethan wasn't so certain. Even in death, Blackwood's shadow loomed large. His men remained at large, likely seeking vengeance for their leader. And beyond them lay the larger question of what future awaited Nakia and Kimmy in a world that offered few safe havens for their kind. But those were concerns for tomorrow. For now, they needed to focus on immediate survival, getting away from the house, finding shelter, living to see another dawn. "Let's go," he said, shouldering the pack. "Stay close. Stay quiet. We'll head west along the creek, try to pick up the patrol's trail." They left through the front door, Ethan carrying Rufus, whose injuries made walking difficult. Blackwood's horse was tethered nearby, a powerful black gelding that snorted nervously at their approach, perhaps smelling its master's blood on them. Ethan helped Nakia and Kimmy mount, then handed Rufus up to them. He untied their own horse from the lean-to and mounted, adjusting the pack to distribute the weight evenly. With one last look at the house, his dream-turned battlefield, Ethan led them away into the night. Behind them, the unfinished structure stood silent under the stars, bearing witness to yet another chapter in the violent history of the frontier. They rode west, following the creek that wound through the valley. The night was clear now, the storm having moved on, leaving a sky ablaze with stars. The air was cool and fresh, scented with damp earth and sage. Despite the beauty of the night, Ethan remained vigilant, constantly scanning their surroundings for any sign of pursuit. Beside him, Nakia rode with equal watchfulness, Kimmy now asleep against her chest, Rufus cradled in her free arm. They had traveled perhaps 2 miles when Ethan heard it, the distant sound of hoofbeats, multiple riders approaching from the east. Blackwood's men most likely coming to check on their leader. "Riders," he whispered, drawing his horse to a halt beneath the shelter of a cottonwood grove. "Coming from the direction of the house." Nakia tensed her arms, tightening protectively around Kimmy. "How many? Can't tell yet. 4 or 5 at least." They had perhaps minutes before the riders would be upon them. There was no time to find better cover, nowhere to hide, that wouldn't be obvious to experienced trackers. "We'll have to make a stand," Ethan decided grimly, dismounting and helping Nakia down with her precious burdens. "Here, in these trees, at least we'll have some cover." He quickly tethered the horses deeper in the grove out of immediate sight. Then he positioned Nakia and Kimi behind the trunk of the largest cottonwood rufus at their feet. "Stay down," he instructed, checking his weapons, the rifle with 3 shots remaining, the pistol with 4. Not enough for a prolonged firefight against multiple opponents. If it goes badly, take the horses and ride west. Don't stop until you reach Fort Grant. Nakia shook her head, her eyes glinting with determination in the starlight. "We stay together," she said firmly. "All of us live, or all of us die." Before Ethan could argue, the riders came into view, 5 men moving at a steady trot along the creek bank, their forms dark silhouettes against the night sky. They were still some distance away, but closing rapidly. Ethan raised his rifle sighting on the lead rider. At this range, in this light, it would be a difficult shot. But if he could take down the leader, perhaps the others would scatter, giving them a chance to escape. His finger tightened on the trigger, the familiar calm of combat descending over him. He exhaled slowly, preparing to fire. Then, from behind the approaching riders, came a new sound. More hoofbeats, these accompanied by the jingle of equipment and the disciplined rhythm of trained cavalry. A voice rang out, authoritative and clear. "Halt, United States Army!" The approaching riders reined in, abruptly caught between the unseen threat in the cottonwood grove and the cavalry patrol now blocking their retreat. "Throw down your weapons," the cavalry officer commanded. "You're surrounded." For a tense moment it seemed the riders might fight. They conferred hastily among themselves, hands hovering near holstered weapons. Then, with obvious reluctance, they raised their hands in surrender. Ethan lowered his rifle, relief washing over him in a dizzying wave. Beside him, Nakia released a shaky breath, her free arm coming around Kimi in a protective embrace. "It's over," Ethan said, the words feeling strange on his tongue. "It's really over." As the cavalry patrol secured the surrendered men, Ethan stepped out from the shelter of the trees, identifying himself to the officer in charge, the same Lieutenant Howard they had encountered earlier. "Mercer!" the young officer exclaimed, clearly surprised. "We've been looking all over for you. When we found your ranch abandoned, we feared the worst." "Blackwood found us," Ethan explained briefly. "We fled, he pursued. There was a confrontation at my property in the valley. Blackwood's dead." Lieutenant Howard's expression grew grave. "And the Apache woman and child?" Ethan replied, gesturing toward the cottonwood grove where Nakia still waited with Kimi and Rufus. "But we need to get them somewhere secure. Blackwood may be gone, but these men aren't the only ones who followed him." Howard nodded, his young face set with determination. "We'll escort you to Fort Grant. The commander there has been following reports about Blackwood's activities at Rattlesnake Canyon. He'll want to take the woman's statement." The cavalrymen quickly organized their expanded party, securing the prisoners, arranging an escort formation, providing a fresh mount for Nakia and Kimi, since Blackwood's horse proved too spirited for them. As they prepared to depart, Lieutenant Howard approached Ethan with a puzzled expression. "One thing I don't understand, Mercer. Why did Blackwood hate you so much? What was between you two?" Ethan glanced toward Nakia, who was settling Kimi on their new horse, her face composed, but her movements betraying exhaustion. "A long story," he replied finally. "One that starts at Snake Valley and ends in that house back there." Howard looked as if he wanted to press for more details, but something in Ethan's expression deterred him. With a respectful nod, he returned to his men, issuing orders for their departure. As the cavalrymen mounted up, Ethan rode over to where Nakia waited, Rufus now comfortably situated in front of Kimi on their horse. "Fort Grant," he said quietly. "It's the safest option for now." Nakia nodded, though her eyes betrayed her uncertainty. "And after?" It was the question that hung between them: what would happen once they reached the fort? Would Nakia and Kimmy be sent to the reservation? Would they be separated from Ethan? Would the army even believe their account of what had happened at Rattlesnake Canyon? "One step at a time," Ethan replied, not having better answers to offer. "For now, we're alive. Blackwood's dead. That's enough for tonight." A small smile touched Nakia's lips, tired but genuine. "Yes," she agreed. "That is enough." As their odd procession set out under the starry sky, cavalry soldiers, prisoners, an ex-sergeant, an Apache woman and her child, and one brave old dog, Ethan, felt the key around his neck, a familiar weight against his chest. For years it had represented failure and loss, a door he could not bring himself to open. Now it stood for something different. A threshold crossed, a past, confronted, a possible future glimpsed. The house remained behind them, empty once more, but forever changed by what had transpired within its walls. Like Ethan himself, it had been built for one purpose, but found another. Like him, it had stood empty, and then found new life, however briefly. And like him, it would wait patient, resilient, ready for whatever came next. The key would open its door again someday. Of that, Ethan was suddenly, inexplicably certain. Fort Grant rose from the desert like a statement of defiance, adobe walls and wooden structures arranged in precise military order, the American flag snapping in the wind above the commander's headquarters. For some, it represented civilization and security in a harsh land. For others, like Nakia, it symbolized the power that had displaced her people and confined them to reservations. As their party approached the gates in the pale light of dawn, Ethan noticed her tension, the slight stiffening of her posture, the way her arms tightened around Kimmy, who still slept against her chest despite the jostling of their journey. "We'll be all right," he said quietly, moving his horse alongside hers. "Lieutenant Howard seems like a decent man, and you have my word, I won't let them separate you from Kimmy." Nakia glanced at him, her dark eyes shadowed with exhaustion but still alert. "Your word carries weight with the Army." "Some," Ethan admitted. "I served with Colonel Remington, the fort commander, during the war. He's a fair man as military men go." She nodded slightly, though her expression remained guarded. After 7 years of captivity under Blackwood, followed by weeks of desperate flight trust, came neither easily nor quickly. The fort gates swung open at Lieutenant Howard's approach. The young officer led their procession into the central parade ground, where curious soldiers paused in their morning duties to observe the unusual arrivals, particularly the prisoners bound and sullen atop their horses and the Apache woman riding beside the lieutenant's civilian companion. Howard dismounted, handing his reins to a waiting private. "I'll report to Colonel Remington immediately," he told Ethan. "In the meantime, I've arranged quarters for you and the woman and child in the visitors' barracks. It's not much, but it's clean and private." "Thank you, Lieutenant," Ethan replied, helping Nakia dismount with her precious burdens. Kimmy had awakened as they entered the fort, her solemn eyes taking in the unfamiliar surroundings with the watchful wariness of a child who had learned caution early. Rufus, too, seemed uneasy, limping close to Ethan's side, his grizzled muzzle wrinkling occasionally in a silent growl as soldiers passed too near. A young corporal appeared to escort them to their quarters, a small Spartan room in a building set apart from the main barracks. It contained 2 narrow cots, a wash basin, and little else, but as Howard had promised, it was clean. More importantly, it offered privacy and a lockable door. "The colonel will want to see you as soon as possible, sir," the corporal informed Ethan as he showed them into the room. "I'll return to escort you when he's ready." "We need food first," Ethan replied firmly. and medical attention for the dog and the child. He gestured to Rufus, whose limping had worsened during their night journey, and to Kimmy, who despite her stoic demeanor showed signs of exhaustion and stress. The corporal hesitated, then nodded. "I'll send the post-surgeon and arrange for breakfast to be brought." When they were alone, Nakia set Kimmy on one of the cots and immediately began examining their quarters, checking the window, testing the door lock, searching for potential escape routes. Ethan recognized the behavior from their early days at his ranch. It was the ingrained caution of someone who had survived by always planning for the worst. "We're safe here for now," he told her, easing himself onto the second cot. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation with Blackwood and the subsequent flight was fading, leaving him acutely aware of his own injuries. The bullet graze along his ribs burned with each movement, and various scrapes and bruises from their journey made themselves known in a chorus of minor complaints. "For now," Nakia echoed the qualifier significant. She sat beside Kimmy, smoothing the child's tangled hair with gentle fingers. "What will happen when they take our statements, when they learn of Blackwood's death?" It was a valid concern. The death of a white man at the hands of an Apache woman, regardless of the circumstances or justification, could easily be twisted into something sinister by those who viewed all natives as savages. "We tell the truth," Ethan said firmly. "All of it. Blackwood's crimes at Rattlesnake Canyon, the massacre at Snake Valley, his pursuit and attack at my house." He met her eyes steadily. "I'll stand witness for you, Nakia. Your actions were self-defense, nothing more." She held his gaze for a long moment, as if searching for certainty in his words. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, for she nodded once, before turning her attention back to Kimmy. The promised breakfast arrived soon after a simple but hearty meal of beans, bacon, and biscuits with coffee for the adults and milk for Kimmy. The post-surgeon followed a gruff but competent man who treated Rufus's injuries with surprising gentleness, then examined the humans with equal care. "Nothing serious," he pronounced, after checking Ethan's bullet graze. "Keep it clean and it'll heal fine. The dog's ribs are cracked, not broken. Rest will mend him." He turned to Nakia and Kimmy, his manner professional, but his eyes betraying curiosity about these unusual patients. "The child shows signs of exhaustion and minor malnutrition, but nothing that good food and rest won't cure. You, ma'am, have remarkable resilience." It was an understated assessment of Nakia's condition. Despite 7 years of captivity, her physical health was surprisingly good, a testament to her determination to survive for her daughter's sake. After the surgeon departed, Ethan encouraged Nakia and Kimmy to rest while he kept watch. They needed no urging. Both were asleep almost as soon as they stretched out on the narrow cot. Rufus, too, dozed at Ethan's feet, occasionally whimpering in his sleep. Left alone with his thoughts, Ethan found his mind returning to the unfinished house in the valley, the home he had started building for Sarah and Emma, now marked by Blackwood's blood. It had been both sanctuary and battlefield, a place of beginnings and endings. What would it become now? And what of his own future? For 3 years, he had existed in a kind of suspended animation, going through the motions of living without truly engaging with life. The arrival of Nakia and Kimmy had changed, that had awakened something in him he had thought long dead. But their paths had crossed because of danger and necessity, not choice. Once that danger had passed, what reason would they have to remain together? His brooding was interrupted by the return of the corporal, who informed him that Colonel Remington was ready to see them. Ethan gently woke Nakia, who came instantly alert, years of survival instincts overriding even the profound exhaustion she must have felt. "The colonel wants to speak with us," he explained, keeping his voice calm and reassuring for Kimmy's benefit. as the child stirred beside her mother. "I'll be with you the whole time." Nakia nodded quickly, smoothing her hair and straightening her clothing, simple acts of dignity in preparation for facing authority. She helped Kimmy do the same, murmuring encouragement in their native language. Together, they followed the corporal across the parade ground to the commander's office, a modest adobe structure distinguished from surrounding buildings only by the flag that flew above it. Ethan noticed how the soldiers they passed stared at Nakia and Kimi, some with curiosity, others with more troubling expressions of contempt or suspicion. He moved closer to them, a silent statement of protection and solidarity. Nakia acknowledged the gesture with the barest nod, her face composed in a mask of calm dignity that belied the tension evident in her rigid posture. Colonel Thomas Remington was much as Ethan remembered him from their wartime service, a tall, lean man with iron-gray hair and penetrating blue eyes that missed little. He had been a captain then, known for his fairness and strategic thinking. The years had added rank and responsibility, but had not fundamentally changed him as far as Ethan could tell from their initial greeting. "Sergeant Mercer," Remington said, rising from behind his desk as they entered. "It's been a long time." "Just Mercer now, Colonel," Ethan corrected. "I left the service after the war." "So I heard." Remington's gaze shifted to Nakia and Kimmy, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "And these must be the Apache woman and child Lieutenant Howard mentioned in his report. Please, all of you, be seated." The interview that followed was thorough but not hostile. Remington listened attentively as Ethan recounted their story, beginning with Kimmy's first appearance at his ranch and continuing through Blackwood's pursuit and their final confrontation at the unfinished house. Nakia spoke as well, her English clear and precise, as she described her captivity at Rattlesnake Canyon and the circumstances of her escape. Throughout, Remington took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions but offering no judgment. His face remained impassive, though Ethan thought he detected a flicker of disgust when Nakia described the conditions at Blackwood's hidden compound. "And you say there were other women held there?" the colonel asked at one point. "Over the 7 years of your captivity?" "Yes," Nakia confirmed, her voice steady despite the painful memories. "Many. Some Apache, some Mexican, a few white women who had the misfortune to cross his path. None lasted long. They either died from the conditions or took their own lives when they could bear no more. Do you know their names, their origins?" "Some, not all." Nakia hesitated, then continued with quiet intensity. "There is a place behind the main house at Rattlesnake Canyon, a small clearing with stones marking graves. 23 stones. 23 women and children who died there." Remington's pen paused over his notebook, the only indication that her words had affected him. "And you can lead us to this place? Identify it on a map?" "Yes." The colonel nodded, making another note before looking up at Ethan. "And the death of Blackwood? You say both of you fired shots?" "Yes," Ethan confirmed. "I wounded him first in the shoulder and then the chest. But it was Nakia's shot that killed him after he attempted to attack me with a knife." "Self-defense, then?" "Unquestionably." Remington sat back in his chair, studying them both for a long moment. "5 of Blackwood's men are now in my custody," he said finally. "They corroborate parts of your story, specifically that Blackwood was obsessed with recapturing you, Mrs." He faltered, realizing he didn't know Nakia's full name. "Just Nakia," she supplied quietly. "Nakia," he repeated, with a respectful nod. "They've also provided information about Rattlesnake Canyon, though I suspect they've minimized their own involvement in what went on there." "What will happen to them?" Ethan asked. "They'll stand trial for their role in the kidnapping and imprisonment of Nakia and the others, as well as for their part in the attack on your property." Remington's expression hardened slightly. "Justice may be imperfect in the territories, but I intend to see it served in this case." He turned his attention to Nakia. "Which brings me to the matter of your status and future. As an Apache woman with no documented tribal affiliation, the standard procedure would be to send you to the San Carlos Reservation." Ethan felt Nakia tense beside him, though her face remained carefully neutral. Kimmy, sensing her mother's distress, pressed closer to her side. "That won't be necessary, Colonel," Ethan said firmly. "Nakia and Kimmy will be coming with me if they choose to do so." Remington raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? And where exactly will you be taking them, Mercer?" It was the question Ethan had been asking himself since their arrival at the fort. The ranch was an option, but it held memories now of Blackwood's intrusion, the beginning of their flight. The unfinished house in the valley was another possibility, but it too was marked by violence and remained incomplete, exposed to the elements in places. Then there was the broader question of what relationship existed between himself, Nakia, and Kimi. They had been thrown together by circumstance, bound by common danger. Now that the danger was passing, what did they owe each other? What did they want from each other? Ethan was saved from immediate response by a knock at the door. Lieutenant Howard entered, saluting his superior before addressing them all. "Sir, a dispatch has arrived from Tucson," he reported. "The territorial governor has taken an interest in the Blackwood case. He's sending a special investigator to interview the witnesses and assess the situation at Rattlesnake Canyon." Remington frowned slightly. "When can we expect this investigator?" "Within the week, sir. In the meantime, the governor requests that all witnesses be treated as guests of the territory and given appropriate accommodations and protection." The colonel's frown deepened momentarily, then cleared. "Very well. Sergeant Mercer, forgive me, Mr. Mercer, and his Apache companions will remain at Fort Grant as guests until the investigator arrives. See that they have everything they need." "Yes, sir." After Lieutenant Howard departed, Remington turned back to Ethan and Nakia. "It seems your immediate future is decided for you," he said with a hint of dry humor. "You'll remain here for the time being. We can discuss longer-term arrangements after the territorial investigation is complete." It was a reasonable compromise, though Ethan noted that Remington had neatly sidestepped the question of whether Nakia would ultimately be sent to the reservation. Still, it bought them time to rest, to recover, to plan their next steps. "Thank you, Colonel," he said, rising, as the officer did the same, indicating the interview was concluded. "We appreciate your hospitality." Remington nodded, his eyes moving between Ethan and Nakia with an expression that suggested he saw more than they might wish him to. "One more thing, Mercer," he said as they turned to leave. "I remember you from Shiloh. You were a good soldier, but more importantly, a good man. I'm glad to see that hasn't changed." The unexpected commendation caught Ethan off guard. He managed a nod of acknowledgement before following Nakia and Kimmy out of the office back into the bright sunlight of the parade ground. The days that followed settled into an unexpected routine. Lieutenant Howard, acting on Colonel Remington's orders, arranged for them to be moved from the Spartan visitors' quarters to a small house at the edge of the officers' row, a two-room structure with a proper kitchen and a small porch usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. The improvement in their circumstances was significant. Nakia and Kimi shared the single bedroom while Ethan made himself comfortable on a cot in the main room. Rufus claimed a spot near the hearth, his injured ribs healing gradually under the continued care of the post-surgeon. They were provided with fresh clothing, regular meals, and a modest allowance for any additional needs. More importantly, they were treated with respect by most of the fort personnel, thanks to Colonel Remington's clear indication that they were to be considered honored guests rather than suspicious characters or worse prisoners. Nakia's initial wariness began to fade as the days passed without incident. She even formed a cautious friendship with the post commander's wife, Sarah Remington, who visited regularly bringing books for Kimmy and engaging Nakia in conversation about traditional Apache medicine. Mrs. Remington, it turned out, had worked as a nurse during the war just as Ethan's late wife had done and shared a similar interest in healing practices from different cultures. Kimmy, resilient as children often are, adapted quickly to their new environment. She spent hours on the small porch drawing with pencils and paper provided by Lieutenant Howard, or playing simple games with Rufus, whose devotion to the child had only deepened during their ordeal. For Ethan, the unexpected respite brought both relief and increasing uncertainty. The immediate danger had passed. Blackwood was dead, his men imprisoned. Nakia and Kimi were safe, their story believed by those in authority. His promise to protect them had been fulfilled. Yet, he found himself reluctant to contemplate what would come next, the inevitable parting that would follow the territorial investigation. Nakia would have choices to make about her future, and Kimmy's, and what would he do? Return to his isolated ranch. Resume his solitary existence, now made more empty by the memory of their brief presence in his life. These thoughts preoccupied him as he sat on the porch one evening watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. Nakia joined him silently, sitting in the second chair, her hands busy with some mending work. For a time they sat in companionable silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Then Nakia spoke, her voice soft in the gathering dusk. Kimmy asked me today if we would be going home with you when the important man from Tucson has finished his questions. Ethan glanced at her, surprised. What did you tell her? Nakia's hands stilled on her work, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon. I told her I did not know, that we would see what path opens before us when the time comes. A wise answer, Ethan commented, though he felt a pang of disappointment at its non-committal nature. Perhaps, Nakia agreed, but not a satisfying one for her or for me. She turned to look at him directly. What are your thoughts, Ethan Mercer? When this investigation is complete, what do you intend to do? It was the question he had been avoiding even in the privacy of his own mind. Now faced with Nakia's direct inquiry, he found he could no longer evade it. I've been thinking about the house, he said slowly. The one in the valley. It needs work, finishing the walls, replacing the broken window, completing the second floor. It could be a good home with some effort. For you alone. The question hung between them, laden with significance. Neither of them had yet been willing to address directly. Ethan's hand went to the key around his neck, the gesture that had become almost unconscious over the years, but now felt deliberate, meaningful. I built it for a family, he said finally. It seems wrong for it to stand empty when there are those who need a home. Nakia set her mending aside, giving him her full attention. Are you offering us shelter, Ethan? A temporary refuge until we find our way? I'm offering more than that, if you want it. The words emerged before he could reconsider them, before caution could override the truth in his heart. I'm offering a home, Nakia, for you and Kimmy, not as guests or refugees, but as family. He hadn't planned to say it, hadn't even fully acknowledged to himself the depth of his feelings until that moment. Yet, as the words hung in the air between them, he recognized their truth. Somewhere amidst the danger and flight, the shared struggle and triumph, his feelings for Nakia and Kimmy had transformed from protection to something deeper, more permanent. Nakia's expression revealed nothing of her reaction to his unexpected declaration. Why, she asked simply, why would you offer this to us? It was a fair question, one that deserved an honest answer. Ethan took a moment to find the right words to articulate feelings that had been developing beneath his conscious awareness for weeks. Because, in the time you've been with me, I've felt more alive than I have in years, he said finally. Because Kimmy's laughter in the house makes it a home again. Because you, he hesitated, then continued with quiet conviction, because you see me as I am with all my failings and regrets, and still choose to stand beside me. He paused, the gravity of what he was proposing settling over him. I know it's sudden. I know we've been thrown together by circumstance rather than choice. I'm not asking for promises or commitments you're not ready to make. Just consider it. Consider staying when all this is over. Nakia was silent for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face as if seeking assurance of his sincerity. The last rays of sunset gilded her features, highlighting the strength and beauty that hardship had not diminished. My people have a saying, she said finally, the path is made by walking it. When I came to your gate that night, I had no plan beyond survival, no hope beyond escaping Blackwood. I could not see a future for Kimmy and myself that did not involve constant flight or the confines of the reservation. She looked toward the open door, through which they could see Kimmy sleeping peacefully on the small bed Rufus curled protectively at her feet. Now I begin to see a different possibility, one I had not dared to imagine. Her eyes returned to Ethan's direct and unwavering. But there are realities we must face, Ethan. I am Apache. You are white. The world does not look kindly on such unions even in these territories. There would be difficulties, prejudices, dangers, perhaps. I know, Ethan acknowledged. I've seen how some of the soldiers look at you, even here where Colonel Remington's authority protects you. It wouldn't be easy. No, Nakia agreed. It would not be easy. But she paused, a small smile touching her lips. Few worthwhile things are. Hope stirred in Ethan's chest, tentative but unmistakable. Does that mean you'll consider it staying with me when this is over? I will do more than consider it, Nakia replied, her voice quiet but firm. If the path remains open to us after the investigation, if we are truly free to choose, then yes, Ethan Mercer, Kimmy and I will come home with you. The simple declaration affected Ethan more profoundly than he would have expected. For 3 years, he had lived without expectation, without hope for the future. Now, in a few words, Nakia had given him something to look forward to, a reason to imagine tomorrow. Before he could respond, a commotion at the fort gates drew their attention. A rider was arriving, his horse lathered from hard riding despite the late hour. Even at a distance, the quality of his clothing and the authoritative way he dismounted suggested a man of some importance. The investigator from Tucson, perhaps. Nakia suggested, her posture tensing slightly as it did whenever new developments occurred. Maybe, Ethan agreed, rising from his chair, though he wasn't expected for several more days. They watched as the newcomer was escorted to Colonel Remington's quarters, disappearing inside after a brief exchange with the sentry. Whatever news the rider brought, it would likely affect them soon enough. Sure enough, less than an hour later, Lieutenant Howard appeared at their door, his expression apologetic, as he informed them that Colonel Remington requested their immediate presence. Has something happened, Lieutenant? Ethan asked, as they prepared to follow him, Nakia waking Kimmy gently and wrapping her in a blanket to carry her. The territorial investigator has arrived early, Howard confirmed. Judge Hollister, he's quite insistent on beginning his interviews tonight. The name meant nothing to Ethan, but he noted the slight hesitation in Howard's voice. Is there something we should know about this judge? The young officer glanced around as if checking for listeners before lowering his voice. He has a reputation for being thorough and not particularly sympathetic to the Apache cause, but, he added quickly, seeing Ethan's expression darken, the colonel will ensure the proceedings are fair. You have his word on that. It was small reassurance, but better than none. As they crossed the darkened parade ground toward the commander's quarters, Ethan moved closer to Nakia and Kimi, a silent promise of protection against whatever new challenge awaited them. Judge Hollister proved to be a formidable presence, a tall, corpulent man with piercing gray eyes and a neatly trimmed white beard. He sat at Colonel Remington's desk, as if it were his own various papers spread before him, a clerk seated nearby, ready to transcribe the proceedings. "Mr. Mercer," he acknowledged as they entered, his voice cultured but cold. "And this must be the Apache woman, Nakia, and the child." There was something in his tone when he mentioned Nakia and Kimi that immediately put Ethan on guard, a subtle inflection that managed to convey both dismissal and suspicion. Judge Hollister has been appointed by the territorial governor to investigate the Blackwood matter. Colonel Remington explained, his own expression carefully neutral, though Ethan thought he detected a hint of tension in the officer's posture. "Indeed," Hollister confirmed, shuffling the papers before him. "A most disturbing case. A prominent citizen found dead allegedly at the hands of an Apache woman who claims he held her captive for 7 years. Extraordinary claims that require extraordinary evidence. Wouldn't you agree?" The phrasing, allegedly, claims, made Ethan's jaw tighten. "The evidence is substantial, Your Honor. 5 of Blackwood's own men have corroborated Nakia's account. Ah, yes, the supposed accomplices. Men who might say anything to save their own skins." Hollister waved a dismissive hand. "But we shall get to that. First, I want to hear the story directly from those involved. From the beginning, if you please." What followed was a more rigorous and far less sympathetic interview than their earlier conversation with Colonel Remington. Judge Hollister questioned every detail, his skepticism evident in his tone and expression. He seemed particularly interested in the exact circumstances of Blackwood's death, pressing Nakia repeatedly on whether the killing had been necessary. "You claim he attacked Mr. Mercer with a knife," he said, his pen tapping against the desk in a distracting rhythm. "Yet by your own account, he had already been wounded twice by Mr. Mercer's rifle. Was he truly such a threat in his wounded state? Could you not have simply disarmed him?" "He was coming at Ethan with a knife," Nakia replied, her composure remarkable despite the hostile questioning. "There was no time for anything but action. I fired to save Ethan's life, nothing more." Hollister made a note, his expression unconvinced. "And you, Mr. Mercer? You claim no prior knowledge of this woman before she appeared at your ranch, yet you immediately took her in, gave her shelter, even taught her to use firearms. Why would you extend such extraordinary assistance to a complete stranger, particularly one of her background?" The implication was clear, and it stirred a cold anger in Ethan's chest. "I helped them because they needed help," he said evenly, "as any decent human being would do. As for teaching Nakia to shoot, that was a practical necessity once we realized Blackwood was hunting them." Hollister's eyes narrowed slightly. "Some might suggest your motives were less altruistic, Mr. Mercer. A man living alone taking in an attractive native woman." "That's enough, Judge." Colonel Remington's voice cut through the tension, sharp with authority. "These witnesses have cooperated fully with your investigation. They deserve to be treated with respect." For a moment, the 2 men locked eyes in a silent battle of wills. Then Hollister inclined his head slightly, a concession that seemed more tactical than sincere. "Of course, Colonel. My apologies if my questions seemed probing. I merely seek the truth, as is my duty." He turned back to Nakia and Ethan. "One final matter for tonight. The issue of the child." Nakia tensed visibly, her arm tightening around the still-sleeping Kimi. "What about my daughter?" "According to your statement, the child was born during your captivity. You claim her father was your husband, killed at Snake Valley. Yet, you have no documentation, no witnesses to support this claim. Only your word. The word of a mother regarding her child should be sufficient." Ethan interjected, his patience wearing thin. "Perhaps in some contexts," Hollister allowed. "But in legal matters, particularly those involving custody and potential criminal proceedings, more substantial evidence is preferred." He shuffled through his papers, extracting a document which he studied with exaggerated care. "I have here a statement from one of Blackwood's captured men, a James Carver, who suggests that Blackwood himself believed the child to be his." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Nakia's face drained of color, but her voice remained steady when she responded. "Blackwood wanted to believe that," she said. "It fed his sense of ownership. But Kimi was conceived before my capture carried through those first terrible months. She is the daughter of Nakohe, my husband, a good man who taught at the mission school. She has his eyes, his smile." Hollister made another note, his expression revealing nothing. "We shall see. I've ordered blood tests for both the child and the deceased. Modern science may provide answers where testimony is inconclusive." "That won't be necessary," Colonel Remington intervened again, his tone brooking no argument. "The child's parentage is not relevant to the investigation of Blackwood's death or the allegations regarding Rattlesnake Canyon." "On the contrary, Colonel," Hollister countered smoothly. "If the child is indeed Blackwood's, it establishes a very different relationship between the deceased and the woman who killed him, one that might suggest motives beyond self-defense." Ethan had heard enough. He rose to his feet, his movement deliberate, but charged with barely contained anger. "Nakia has endured 7 years of captivity and abuse at Blackwood's hands," he said, his voice low but intense. "She has been hunted, shot at, and very nearly killed. She has shown remarkable courage and dignity throughout. And now you sit here in the safety of this office and suggest that her account, corroborated by multiple witnesses, including myself, is somehow insufficient, that her child should be subjected to invasive procedures to satisfy your curiosity." Hollister remained unmoved by the outburst. "Your passion is noted, Mr. Mercer, though it does little to advance the cause of impartial justice. Perhaps your involvement in this matter has become excessively personal." "That's enough for tonight," Colonel Remington declared, standing as well. "It's late, and these people have been through a considerable ordeal. We will reconvene tomorrow when everyone is rested." For a moment it seemed Hollister might object. Then, with a slight shrug that suggested the delay was of no consequence to him, he gathered his papers. "As you wish, Colonel, though I must insist that no one leave the fort without my express permission. These witnesses are central to my investigation." "They have no intention of leaving," Remington assured him. "Lieutenant Howard will escort them back to their quarters." As they followed the lieutenant across the parade ground, now shrouded in full darkness, Ethan could feel the tension radiating from Nakia. She walked stiffly, her face a mask of controlled emotion, Kimi still mercifully asleep against her shoulder. "The judge exceeded his authority in there," Lieutenant Howard said quietly, once they were out of earshot of the commander's quarters. "Colonel Remington won't allow any blood tests or other such nonsense. You have his word on that." "Thank you, Lieutenant," Ethan replied, appreciating the young officer's attempt at reassurance, but knowing that words alone couldn't undo the damage Hollister's insinuations had caused. When they reached their quarters, Nakia immediately took Kimi to the bedroom, closing the door behind them. Ethan thanked Howard again, then sat heavily on his cot, the events of the evening weighing on him like a physical burden. He wasn't surprised when nearly an hour later, the bedroom door opened and Nakia emerged. She had changed into the simple nightgown provided by Mrs. Remington, her long hair loose around her shoulders. In the dim light of the single lamp Ethan had left burning, she looked both vulnerable and resolute. "Kimi is still sleeping," she said, sitting in the chair opposite his cot. "She does not know what was said tonight. I would keep it that way." "Of course," Ethan agreed. "Hollister had no right to make such accusations. Colonel Remington won't let him pursue that line of inquiry." "Perhaps not, but the damage is done." Nakia's hands twisted in her lap, the only outward sign of her distress. "The seed has been planted. Others will wonder, will question. Kimi will face such suspicions all her life if we remain in this territory." The implication was clear. "You're thinking of leaving," Ethan said, the hope he had felt earlier in the evening fading like mist in the morning sun. "I am thinking of my daughter," Nakia corrected gently. "Of what life will be like for her growing up, where such things can be said without consequence, where her very existence can be questioned in a legal proceeding." "Hollister is one man," Ethan argued, though he knew the judge represented a broader reality. "Not everyone thinks as he does." "No," Nakia agreed. "There are good people like Colonel Remington, like Lieutenant Howard, like you." Her expression softened momentarily, then grew serious again. "But they are not the majority, Ethan. You know this as well as I do." He couldn't deny the truth of her words. The territories were changing, but slowly, and old hatreds died hard. A mixed-race family would face challenges, particularly one that included an Apache woman with a complicated past. "What will you do?" he asked, dreading her answer but needing to hear it. Nakia was silent for a moment, her gaze turning toward the small window where stars were visible in the night sky. "There are Apache bands in the north who have not been confined to reservations," she said finally. "My mother's people. They live freely following the old ways. Kimi could grow up among them knowing her heritage, free from the kind of scrutiny she would face here." The plan made sense, Ethan had to admit. It offered Nakia and Kimi a chance at a life without the constant shadow of prejudice and suspicion that Hollister represented. But the thought of them leaving, of never seeing them again, created a hollow ache in his chest. "And us?" he asked quietly. "What of what we discussed earlier?" Nakia met his eyes directly, her own shining with unshed tears. "What I said was true, Ethan. If the path were open to us, I would choose to stay with you, to make a home with you. But tonight has shown me that path may be closed not by our own wishes, but by the world around us." "We could leave together," Ethan suggested, the idea forming as he spoke it. "The three of us. Start fresh somewhere else, California perhaps, or Oregon, somewhere far from Blackwood's shadow, from Hollister's influence." It was an impulsive proposal, yet as soon as the words left his mouth, Ethan knew he meant them. The ranch, the unfinished house, they were places, structures, things that could be replaced. What couldn't be replaced was the family he had begun to envision with Nakia and Kimi. Surprise flickered across Nakia's face, followed by a more complex emotion, hope tempered by caution. "You would leave everything you have built here, your ranch, the house in the valley." "They're just places," Ethan said. "What matters is who shares them with you." For the first time that evening, Nakia smiled, a small, tentative expression that nonetheless transformed her face, revealing the woman she might have been had life dealt her a gentler hand. "You speak from the heart, Ethan Mercer. It is one of the things I have come to value in you." She rose, moving to stand before him, close enough that he could see the flecks of amber in her dark eyes, could catch the faint scent of sage that always seemed to cling to her. "Let us not decide tonight," she said softly. "The future will reveal itself in time. For now know that whatever path opens before us, I am grateful for the one we have walked together thus far." Before Ethan could respond, she leaned forward and with gentle deliberation pressed her lips to his forehead, a gesture of such unexpected tenderness that he found himself momentarily speechless. Then, with a final small smile, she returned to the bedroom, closing the door quietly behind her. Ethan remained sitting on his cot for a long time afterward, his hand moving unconsciously to touch the spot where Nakia's lips had brushed his skin. Outside, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small dramas of human lives played out beneath them. Yet to Ethan, the world felt suddenly significantly changed. Whatever happened with Hollister's investigation, whatever challenges lay ahead, he was no longer the isolated, emotionally dormant man who had set 3 empty plates at his table each night. He had found something he thought lost forever: connection, purpose, the possibility of love. And he would not surrender it without a fight. The following morning brought both clarity and complication. They were summoned again to Colonel Remington's office, but this time found the colonel alone, his expression grave yet determined. "Judge Hollister has departed for Rattlesnake Canyon," he informed them without preamble. "He insisted on seeing the site for himself, accompanied by a detachment of my men. They left at first light." "Without completing our interviews?" Ethan asked, surprised by this sudden change in procedure. "The judge felt that examining the physical evidence might provide context for your testimonies." Remington's tone suggested he found this reasoning suspect, but had been powerless to prevent it. "He expects to return within 3 days." "And until then?" Nakia inquired Kimmy, sitting quietly beside her, absorbed in a small wooden toy Lieutenant Howard had carved for her. "Until then, you remain as guests of the fort," Remington replied. Then, with a glance toward the door to ensure they were truly alone, he added in a lower voice, "Though if you were to decide your future lies elsewhere, I would find it difficult to allocate resources to prevent your departure, particularly during the next 24 hours, when many of my men will be occupied with training exercises in the Eastern Quadrant." The implication was clear and surprisingly welcome. Colonel Remington was offering them an opportunity to leave to escape whatever judgment Hollister might render upon his return. "Why would you do that?" Ethan asked, careful to match the colonel's discreet tone. Remington's gaze moved from Ethan to Nakia, then to Kimmy, who was now looking up at him with solemn curiosity. "Because I've read Hollister's preliminary report to the governor," he said finally. "It suggests that regardless of the evidence at Rattlesnake Canyon, he intends to recommend that the child be placed in a government school for Indian children and that Nakia be returned to San Carlos under supervision." Nakia's sharp intake of breath was the only outward sign of her distress, but Ethan felt as if he'd been physically struck. Government schools for Indian children were notorious places where native children were stripped of their language, culture, and identity in the name of civilization. And the supervision Hollister envisioned for Nakia at San Carlos would amount to little more than another form of imprisonment. "He can't do that," Ethan protested, though he knew full well that in the current political climate, with the right connections, Hollister could indeed do exactly that. "There's no legal basis. He doesn't need much of one," Remington interrupted grimly. "Just enough to satisfy the territorial authorities that he's acting in the interest of proper order and civilization. The governor is up for re-election this year with strong opposition from anti-Indian factions. He needs to appear firm on native issues." The colonel straightened his voice, returning to its official tone. I've said all I can on the matter. Lieutenant Howard will continue to serve as your escort during your stay. If you require anything, he is authorized to provide it within reason." With that, they were dismissed, left to contemplate the stark choice before them, wait for Hollister's return, and face potential separation or flee while they had the chance, becoming fugitives once more. Back in their quarters, Ethan and Nakia spoke in hushed tones while Kimmy played with Rufus on the small porch. The dog's injuries now healed enough that he could engage in gentle activity. "Remington is offering us a way out," Ethan said. "We should take it, tonight, when the fort is quietest." Nakia nodded, her decision evidently made. "Yes, we cannot risk Hollister separating us from Kimmy, but," she added, her eyes searching his, "this changes things for you, Ethan. If you come with us, you become a fugitive too. You would be leaving everything behind: your ranch, your property, your standing as a free citizen." It was a significant sacrifice, Ethan couldn't deny that. But as he looked at Nakia, at Kimmy playing innocently nearby, he knew there was no real choice to make. "I meant what I said last night," he told her. "Places can be rebuilt, possessions replaced. What matters is who you share your life with." He took her hand, a gesture more intimate than any they had yet shared. "I choose you and Kimmy. Whatever comes next, we face it together." The simple declaration seemed to release something in Nakia, a final reservation perhaps, or a lingering doubt about his commitment. Her fingers tightened around his, her eyes bright with emotion. Together, she repeated the word, both acknowledgement and promise. They spent the day in careful preparation, gathering supplies, without appearing to do so, discussing routes and destinations in coded language that would not alert any potential listeners. Lieutenant Howard, visiting in the afternoon, seemed to understand their intentions without being told. He left them with extra provisions for the coming days and a detailed map of the territories, certain sections marked with particular emphasis. As dusk approached, bringing with it the promise of imminent departure, Ethan found himself drawn to the small window, looking out at the fort that had been their temporary sanctuary. Beyond its walls lay uncertainty, danger, the possibility of pursuit, yet also freedom, a chance at the life they had begun to envision together. His hand went to the key around his neck, the token he had carried for so long as a reminder of loss and failure. Now it represented something different, not the past, but the future, not what was lost, but what might yet be found. A soft touch on his arm drew his attention. Nakia stood beside him, Kimmy at her side, both dressed for travel in the practical clothing provided by Mrs. Remington. Rufus sat at their feet, his tail sweeping the floor in anticipation of movement, of action. "It is time," Nakia said simply. Ethan nodded, gathering the small pack he had prepared. The eastern sky was darkening to indigo, the first stars appearing overhead. Soon, the training exercises Remington had mentioned would draw most of the garrison to the far side of the fort, creating the diversion they needed to slip away unnoticed. As they waited for full darkness to fall, Ethan felt a small hand slip into his. Looking down, he found Kimmy gazing up at him, her solemn eyes holding a question. "Are you coming with us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Forever." The simple query, with its profound implication, caught at Ethan's heart. He knelt to meet her at eye level, his voice equally soft, but certain. "Yes," he promised. "Forever." A rare, brilliant smile illuminated the child's face. With the unself-conscious directness of youth, she threw her arms around his neck in a swift, fierce embrace. "Good," she declared. "Mama needs you, and so do I." Over Kimmy's shoulder, Ethan met Nakia's gaze. In her eyes, he saw confirmation of the child's simple truth. They needed him, yes, but equally important, he needed them. The circle of their lives had somehow become complete in the joining. When full darkness descended and the sounds of the training exercise rose from the eastern section of the fort, they slipped out through the small side gate Lieutenant Howard had casually mentioned was often left unguarded. True to his word, no sentry challenged their passage as they made their way to the stables, where 3 horses waited saddled and provisioned. The night embraced them as they rode westward, away from the fort lights, away from Hollister's judgment, and the limitations others would impose upon them. The desert stretched before them vast and beautiful under the star-strewn sky, a landscape of challenge and possibility. They rode in silence, conserving energy for the long journey ahead. Kimmy, seated before Nakia on her horse, soon fell asleep, lulled by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. Rufus trotted alongside them, his old body seemingly rejuvenated by this new adventure. It was only when the fort had disappeared entirely behind them, swallowed by distance and darkness, that Ethan allowed himself to look ahead, rather than behind. Somewhere to the west lay California, Oregon, beyond that places where a man, a woman, and a child might start fresh, might build a life together, without the shadows of the past darkening their days. The key around his neck swung gently with his horse's motion, a familiar weight against his chest. Sarah and Emma would always be part of him, their memory preserved in the quiet chambers of his heart. But now, riding beside Nakia and Kimmy under the endless desert sky, Ethan felt something he had thought forever lost to him: hope. Not just for survival, not merely for safety, but for happiness. For love. For the extraordinary possibility of family found in the aftermath of loss. The desert night cradled them in its vastness, the stars lighting their way forward. And as they rode toward whatever future awaited them, Ethan Mercer felt, for the first time in years, that he was truly going home.